Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Silent House. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in the old house. But the silence felt wrong. I had moved in only a few weeks ago, seeking peace after a turbulent time in my life. The house, nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in the southwest, appeared safe and secluded. Its walls were aged, the floors creaked with every step, but there was something oddly comforting about the familiarity of its decay. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started on the first night. I was alone, unpacking the last of the boxes in the living room. The dim light of a single lamp flickered above me, casting long shadows across the room. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. My name. Sarah. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the house settling. The old structure seemed to have a life of its own, creaking and groaning as though it was speaking to me. But when the whisper came again, clearer this time, I froze. Sarah. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. No one was there. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After all, houses like this were bound to make strange noises. I moved to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and tried to calm myself. But when I returned to the living room, I heard it again, this time from behind me. Sarah. It was closer, almost a breath on my neck. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. Everything was secure. But as I stood there in the center of the room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the house itself was aware of me, aware of my presence. The whispers didn't stop. They became a constant hum in the back of my mind, always just on the edge of hearing, never loud enough to fully understand, but always there. As the days passed, I began to hear the whispers more frequently, and they were no longer limited to just my name. They started to repeat fragments of things I had never told anyone, things I had never spoken out loud. Don't go upstairs. Leave before it's too late. I tried to ignore them, to pretend they were nothing more than my overactive imagination. But they grew louder, more urgent. The strangest part? No matter how hard I searched, I never found the source. There was no one in the house. The windows were locked, the doors closed. Yet the whispers never stopped. Then, one night, the shadows started to move. It was late, around midnight, when I saw it for the first time. I was sitting in the living room, my eyes growing heavy, when I noticed something strange in the corner of the room. A shadow. It wasn't just a play of light from the lamp, this was different. This shadow seemed alive. It shifted, slowly elongating, stretching across the walls until it was no longer just a shadow, but a dark figure. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was gone. But the moment I looked away, the whispers began again. Louder now, more insistent. Sarah, help me. I stumbled back in my chair, my breath catching in my throat. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Was the house haunted? Or was I just imagining it all? I couldn't be sure. The longer I stayed, the more I questioned my sanity. But the strange events didn't stop. They escalated. Each night, the shadows grew bolder. The whispers became more direct, more insistent. Sometimes, they even sounded like other voices, faint, distant cries for help, or desperate pleas for release. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't stay in this house much longer without answers. But even as I made plans to investigate, a part of me knew, deep down, that whatever was in this house was far beyond my understanding. And I had no idea just how much danger I was in. The nights had become unbearable. Each one felt like a battle against something invisible, something lurking just beyond my reach. The whispers had escalated to the point where they followed me everywhere, down the halls, into the bathroom, even into the kitchen when I tried to make a simple cup of coffee. I thought I might be losing my mind. Perhaps it was the isolation, the long hours spent in the house by myself, that were taking their toll. But the shadows, the way they moved, the way they seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision, always just a little too quick for me to catch directly, it wasn't normal. That night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand the anxiety gnawing at me any longer. I needed to know what was going on, even if it meant facing whatever it was head on. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating. As I stepped onto the second floor, the temperature seemed to drop. A chill wrapped around me, and I pulled my sweater tighter against my body. It wasn't just cold, it was unnaturally cold. Like the house was exhaling a bitter breath. The whispers were now constant, swirling in my mind, urging me to stop. "Don't go up," one voice hissed. "Leave, before it's too late." Another one moaned. I couldn't understand it. Was this some kind of warning? Were they trying to tell me something? I couldn't let go of the thought that there was something hidden in this house, something that had been here long before I arrived. I moved down the hall, my flashlight trembling in my grip. It illuminated the peeling wallpaper and old, creaky doors. As I walked, I thought I saw something shift in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. Just the empty hallway. I paused in front of the door to the attic. It had been locked when I moved in, and I hadn't dared open it. But now, the handle was strangely cold to the touch, as though someone had been there just moments before. I tried to turn it, but it was stuck. It felt as though something was resisting me, as if the door itself didn't want to open. My pulse quickened. The whispers around me grew louder, almost deafening now. "Go back, please." I yanked harder on the door. It creaked and groaned, finally giving way with a loud crack. Inside, the attic was dark, the only light coming from my shaking flashlight. I hesitated, peering into the black void. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The silence in here was suffocating. I stepped inside. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into near total darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, the beam flickering as it tried to hold onto its last bit of power. Then I heard it. A low, shuffling sound coming from the far end of the attic. It was soft at first, like the rustling of paper. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow, dragging steps. I froze. My mind raced to find an explanation. Maybe it was just the house settling, or rats in the walls. But the longer I listened, the more my stomach churned with fear. These weren't just the sounds of a house shifting. This was something alive. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a blur, a shape in the shadows. But as my flashlight beam landed on it, my blood ran cold. There, in the far corner, was a figure. A dark silhouette, barely distinguishable from the shadows surrounding it. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like a person, but its form was wrong, distorted, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, hiding its true shape. And its eyes, oh God, its eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. A pale, sickly yellow that seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The air around me grew heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. Then, a voice, one I recognized, whispered in my ear. "Help me." It was my own voice, but it sounded warped, twisted. A low, guttural version of my own words. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The air grew colder, colder than I had ever felt before. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, in an instant, it moved. The shadow darted forward, so fast it was almost a blur. I screamed and bolted for the door, slamming into it with all my weight. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned to face the thing, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The whispers now flooded my mind, screams, sobs, the sound of claws scraping against wood. And then, the figure spoke again, louder now, its voice an echo in the vast emptiness of the attic. "You're too late." I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at that figure in the corner of the attic. Time seemed to stretch, warp, as though the very air around me was bending. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of distorted voices, all calling out in unison, some desperate, others mocking. "Leave, now! Help me! You can't escape!" The figure shifted again, its form rippling like liquid in the darkness, its movements unnatural, too fluid. Then it spoke once more, its voice a strange, guttural mix of my own and something else, something ancient, something wrong. "You are mine now." My breath caught in my throat. The words didn't make sense. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the floor was tilting beneath me. I tried the door again, pulling desperately, but it wouldn't open. It was as though something, or someone, on the other side was holding it shut, preventing me from escaping. My mind raced. I had to get out of here. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized, whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just the house. The house was part of it. It was the thing in the attic. And I had been brought here. Trapped here. Like all the others before me. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. I gasped, my vision plunging into complete darkness. The oppressive silence that followed was even worse than the whispers. I could hear my breath, shallow and panicked, echoing in my ears. I felt around in the dark, my hands trembling, desperately searching for something to hold on to, anything that would bring me comfort. Then I felt it, something wet. Something cold. I pulled my hand back, wiping it on my pants. The moisture was thick, like blood. I ran my fingers across the wall, trying to steady myself, but the walls seemed to close in, constricting. The space around me felt smaller, tighter. The air grew heavier with each passing second. And then I heard it. A skittering sound. Something moving in the dark with me. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something crawling. I felt a brush against my leg, a soft, chilling touch that sent a wave of terror through me. I screamed, stumbling backward, my body crashing against the floor. My flashlight flickered back to life, and I found myself staring into the darkness of the far corner. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone anymore. Something else was in the attic with me. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low growl, something primal, ancient. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, growing darker, deeper. And then I saw it, eyes. Dozens of eyes, glowing faintly from the corners of the attic. I couldn't count them. They were everywhere. They stared at me, unblinking, as though they were waiting, watching. I backed up, my body trembling, but the shadows pressed in closer. I could hear something moving, scurrying, behind me. Tiny claws clicking against the wooden floor. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the eyes. And then they spoke. All of them, in unison, the voices blending into a single horrific sound. Join us. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me as I collapsed onto the floor. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, the panic rising in my chest, choking me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though the very walls of the attic were closing in on me, suffocating me. And then, in the darkness, I saw it. A shadow, a massive, grotesque shape, slithering toward me, its body shifting and writhing in the darkness. The sound of hundreds of tiny feet skittering across the floor grew louder. The thing was coming for me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edge of the doorframe, desperately trying to free myself, but the door wouldn't open. It felt as though the house itself was holding me here, trapping me, keeping me from escaping. The thing was almost upon me now. I could feel its presence, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I heard its breath, slow, steady, a heavy rasp that made my skin crawl. And then, as I turned to face it, I saw the figure again. It wasn't alone. The attic was filled with them, twisted, distorted shapes, shadows that moved like liquid, like darkness itself. They hovered, watching, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me. Their whispers filled the space, growing louder, filling every corner of my mind. Sarah, it's too late. I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. My mind was broken, my body was weak, and I could feel the cold tendrils of despair wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the dark. The shadows seemed to swallow everything. There was no escape. No way out. As the last bit of light flickered and died, I was consumed by the darkness. The whispers faded into nothingness. And then, there was only silence. When I woke up, it was dark. Not the same kind of dark that had swallowed me in the attic, but a thick, unnatural darkness, one that seemed to press down on my chest. The air was suffocating, and I couldn't move at first, couldn't even breathe. It felt like I was floating, or buried, trapped in something that wasn't quite solid, yet held me tighter than any physical constraint could. But slowly, my mind began to clear, the fog lifting from my thoughts. I could feel the cold floor beneath me, rough and damp. The walls around me were closing in, but they were familiar, wooden, old, just like the house. My flashlight lay beside me, still on, its weak beam flickering like a dying candle. I reached for it, but my hand trembled uncontrollably. I pushed myself up, my body sore, my head pounding. I looked around, everything was the same, yet everything was different. The room had changed. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the furniture, which had once been so ordinary, now looked out of place, as if it didn't belong. It was too quiet. There was no creaking of the house, no sounds of life. Just an oppressive silence that crawled under my skin. And then I heard it. A soft, distant sound, a faint scratching, like claws dragging against wood. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. My mind fought against the thought, tried to rationalize it, but the noise continued, growing louder, more distinct. I stood, unsteady, and moved toward the source. It wasn't coming from the attic anymore. No, this sound was coming from downstairs. The thought of returning to the basement, the heart of the house, made my stomach twist. But I had to know. I had to understand what had happened. Why I was still here. I slowly descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder with every step, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling level. The house felt wrong. It felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The moment I reached the bottom, the scratching stopped. I stood in the darkened hallway, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. The walls were covered in dampness now, the paint peeling away in strips like decaying flesh. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, and yet I felt like I was standing at the end of it, as if the house itself was folding in on me. Then I saw something move, a shadow, just out of the corner of my eye. I turned, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Or so I thought. Something in the corner of the room caught my attention, a small figure, no taller than a child, standing motionless in the far corner. My breath caught. It was just a silhouette, barely visible in the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, waiting. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped even more, and my breath came out in invisible puffs. I stepped forward cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the wall to steady myself. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, cold, and almost comforting. "Sarah, you're finally awake." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice, my own voice, rang in my ears, but it wasn't mine. It was twisted, distorted, like a mockery of who I was. I spun around, my heart racing, but the figure was gone. The room was empty again. Panic surged through me. I backed toward the door, eyes scanning every corner of the room. But there was no escape. No way out. Then I saw them. The eyes. Hundreds of them, glowing faintly from the shadows, watching me, waiting. Their presence was suffocating. My chest tightened as they drew closer, closer, until the space around me was filled with their malignant gaze. The scratching returned. It wasn't just from one place now, it was all around me. From the walls, from the floor. Tiny claws, sharp and frantic. I could hear them getting closer, feel them moving in. I turned, but the door was gone. The hallway had vanished. The house had swallowed me whole. The eyes were everywhere now. And in the distance, I saw the figure once more, the thing that had been waiting for me. It was tall, its shape indistinct in the darkness, but its eyes were clear, those same yellow eyes, staring at me, filling my vision. "You can't leave," it said, its voice a chorus of my own twisted echoes. "You never could." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs gave way, and I collapsed onto the cold floor. The shadows closed in, and I felt myself being pulled deeper into the darkness. The walls pressed against me, the eyes growing larger, the whispers louder. And then, everything went silent. The last thing I saw were those eyes. The last thing I heard was the scraping of claws, growing louder, closer. And then, I was no longer alone. The darkness was all-encompassing. I couldn't see, couldn't feel anything except for the pressure closing in on me, squeezing me into a tight, suffocating ball of terror. There was no escape. No way out. No way to fight it. I could hear the sounds again, the scratching, the scurrying. But it was different now. It wasn't just claws against wood. It was something more, something heavier. Something that was moving closer, closing the gap between us. And then came the whispers, no longer distant but sharp, urgent, like voices screaming in my head, each one pleading for attention, demanding I listen. "Join us," they whispered, over and over again, until I could no longer tell where one voice ended and the next began. I tried to move, tried to force myself to scream, but my body refused to cooperate. My limbs were frozen, stiff, as if the darkness had wrapped itself around me, holding me in place. Then I felt it. A sharp, cold pressure against my chest. It was like something had pressed a hand against me, but it wasn't a hand. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting in this house for far longer than I could comprehend. I could feel it, moving through me, crawling inside me, filling my lungs with its cold presence. It wasn't just the house. The house was part of it. The walls. The floor. The air I breathed. It all belonged to this thing. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a choking, rasping sound. My chest was tight, my throat burning. But the darkness was tightening around me as well, pushing, pulling, making everything feel like it was collapsing inward. I felt the ground beneath me start to shift, to give way. And then I heard it again, that voice. "You are mine now." It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. It filled every corner of the room, every inch of space, until I could no longer distinguish between the voice and the darkness itself. It was a part of me, and I was a part of it. There was no distinction anymore. The figure appeared before me again, that shape that had been watching, waiting. Its form was shifting, like a reflection in water, constantly changing. But its eyes, those yellow, glowing eyes, remained constant, locked on mine, filled with an almost cruel sense of recognition. "You knew this would happen," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "You all knew. The house calls. It calls for the lost. The forgotten. The ones who can't leave." I tried to speak, tried to argue, to make sense of what was happening. But I couldn't. My mouth moved, but no sound came out. The words were trapped inside me, as trapped as I was in this place. Why? Why me? I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper, choked with fear. The figure chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed in my mind. "You were always meant to come here. The house has a way of pulling the lost ones in. And once it has you, it won't let go. Not until it has taken everything. Until you are part of it. I could feel it now. The pressure. The weight of it sinking deeper into my bones. My mind was unraveling, coming apart at the seams, but there was no escape from it. No way out. I had fallen into its trap. The house had claimed me. It wasn't just the house. It was the house and everything within it. It was the thing that had been waiting for so long, hiding in the shadows, feeding off the lost souls that had wandered in. I was just another one of them now. Another broken soul, swallowed whole by the darkness. You will never leave, the figure said, its voice cold and final. You are part of it now. Forever. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the image, the voice. But it was useless. The darkness was inside me now, a part of me. It would never let me go. And then, just as quickly as it had come, everything stopped. The whispers. The scratching. The pressure. It all vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. But I knew what it meant. I knew what was happening. The house was still there, waiting, watching. It was waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. Waiting for someone else to take my place. And I knew that when they came, they wouldn't find me. Not anymore. Cursed port. The fog never lifted in the port of San Francisco. It clung to the air, curling and shifting like an omen that refused to leave. Most days, the fog was thick enough to swallow the very air, reducing visibility to mere inches. But it wasn't just the fog that made people uneasy. It was the ships. When I first arrived at the port, I had no idea what I was stepping into. I had heard rumors, of course. Who hasn't? Strange things happen around the water. But nothing prepared me for the truth that was waiting at the edge of the dock. It started with the arrival of the first ghost ship. It wasn't so much that the ship was unusual. After all, this was a working port, but it was the way it appeared. No one had seen it coming. It emerged from the mist, moving like a phantom. Its sails were tattered, its wood worn with age, and its deck empty. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, ships did drift in and out of the fog all the time. But there was something about this ship, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't belong here. Not in this time. Not in this world. I tried to tell myself that it was just an old cargo ship, maybe abandoned years ago, that had somehow found its way back. But when the crew didn't show, when the ship sat there, still as a corpse, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next day, another ship appeared. And then another. Each one emerged from the mist, one after another, as though they had been waiting for the fog to rise, and each one carried a strange energy that made the air feel heavy. People started to avoid the docks at night, even the seasoned sailors, the ones who'd seen everything the sea could throw at them. They said the ships weren't like anything they'd ever encountered before. It wasn't just the way they looked. It was the presence they brought with them. A kind of hunger. That's when people started disappearing. It was small at first. A worker who'd stayed out too late on the docks. A couple of curious souls who tried to board one of the ships. Each time, they were never seen again. The authorities dismissed it as accidents, people falling into the water, maybe, or being lost in the fog. But the disappearances kept happening. One by one, workers, dockhands, tourists, vanishing without a trace. The rumors spread quickly. Some claimed that the ships were cursed, that they were carrying souls doomed to wander the seas for eternity. Others said the ships were alive, drawn to the port by some unknown force, waiting for the right moment to claim their next victim. I couldn't stay away. The mystery gnawed at me, pulling me closer with every passing day. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something darker. I started to work with a small group of others, those who had noticed the strange patterns and wanted to uncover the truth. We spent days, then nights, watching the ships, observing their every movement, looking for any clue, any hint of what they really were. But the longer we watched, the more the mystery deepened. There were no crew members. The ships didn't dock. They didn't unload. They just floated there, motionless, as though they were waiting for something. Or someone. One night, I stayed out longer than I should have. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing the docks in a thick blanket. The sounds of the night, the usual creaks and groans of the port, fell silent. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. That's why I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the dock. A man, no, not quite a man. His features were hazy, like smoke, indistinct. But his eyes, they gleamed, cold and unblinking, staring right at me through the fog. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped forward, drawn to him despite every instinct telling me to run. The air around me grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle into my bones. "Don't go any closer," a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure in the fog began to move, gliding toward the ship. Without thinking, I followed. My legs moved of their own accord, stepping onto the creaky wooden planks of the dock. I reached the edge, where the ship waited, still as death. The figure turned, his face still a blur, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to burn through the fog. I could hear whispers now, soft voices carried on the wind. Unintelligible. Distant. Then, the deck of the ship creaked. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the ship began to move, as though waking from a long, deep slumber. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the same force that had drawn me here. I didn't notice the shadow creeping behind me until it was too late. I turned just in time to see a pair of glowing eyes piercing through the fog, emerging from the shadows like two lanterns in the dark. The air around me grew thick, heavy with an unnatural chill, and I could almost hear the faintest scratching sound, like claws against stone. The shadow that followed was no longer human. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its form was twisted, as if parts of it didn't quite belong. It moved with a deliberate, unnatural grace, its limbs too long, its body bending at angles, as though it were made of something wrong. Something that didn't belong to this world. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as it approached, the chill of the air wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My legs screamed for me to run, but my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot. It stopped just a few feet away, towering over me. Its face was a blur of shadow, but the eyes, they were unmistakable. There was something ancient in those eyes, a hunger that stretched beyond time itself, something that had been waiting for centuries to feed again. I took a step back, but my foot caught on the edge of a loose plank, and I stumbled, falling to the ground. The shadow loomed over me, its form flickering like smoke, and I could hear the sound of its breath, slow, deep, like something dead trying to exhale. "Get away from it," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream echoing inside my head, drowning out everything else. It's already too late. I scrambled to my feet, trying to back away, but I wasn't alone. The fog seemed to shift around me, twisting, closing in like a living thing, cutting off every escape route. The shadow moved with it, its shape flickering, disappearing and reappearing in the mist like some nightmarish phantom. Suddenly, there was a sound, a loud crack, followed by a heavy, wet thud. The ship. It was moving, as though some invisible hand had shoved it forward, propelling it into the dock with terrifying speed. And then, I saw them. Shadows pouring from the ship, figures, no, creatures, moving in the fog, their eyes glowing like fireflies. They moved swiftly, silently, closing in around me. I ran. I didn't even know where I was running to, I just needed to get away from them. But the creatures were fast, and their claws scraped against the wood of the dock, sending a shiver down my spine. They were closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the mist, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. There had to be a reason for this. There had to be an explanation. But all I could think was how wrong it all felt, how deeply wrong. I looked back for a moment, just to see how far behind I was, and that was when I saw the ship again, only it wasn't where it had been. It was right there, looming over the dock, impossibly close, as if it had moved in an instant. And then I saw the faces. Pale, gaunt faces pressed up against the ship's rotting wood, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths moving in silent screams. They were trapped. Just like I was. Their faces were familiar. People I had seen before, workers, tourists, friends. The creatures behind me howled, their cries echoing through the fog, and I felt a presence behind me, breathing down my neck, a cold, foul breath that tasted like death. I turned to face it. I had no choice. The shadow was standing right in front of me now, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, its form shifting like smoke. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like the wind through a broken window. "None of you can." I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The fog thickened, swirling around me, and the creatures closed in. There was no way out. I felt the cold touch of claws on my skin, and the world around me went dark. I woke up in the same place. The dock. The fog. The ship. But it wasn't real, was it? The figures were still there, their faces still pressed against the wood. Their eyes still wide in silent terror. I wasn't the first to fall into the curse of the port. And I wouldn't be the last. In the end, the port would be abandoned. The ships would keep coming, as they always did. Silent, empty, waiting. And those who stayed too long would vanish into the fog, their names lost to time. Just like all the others before them. And the curse would live on. Forever. The Stranger Among Us. It was a quiet, unassuming town in Virginia. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. I had lived here all my life, my feet planted firmly on familiar soil, in streets I could navigate with my eyes closed. But something about this town, about these gatherings, always made me uneasy. It wasn't the people. It was the feeling that something wasn't right, something always lurking just out of sight. And no matter how many times we had our local festivals, our barbecues, our parades, there was one person who always showed up. I couldn't recall ever seeing them before, not in a conversation, not in any official capacity, and yet, there they were every time. A tall figure, standing just at the edge of the crowd, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a white hat. Their face was never clear in my memory, like a reflection in a mirror that distorts when you look too long. This happened every year. Every single one. But here's the strange part, no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they never acknowledged it. Not a single person could ever recall their name. If you asked anyone about the person at the festival, they would tell you they had seen them before, but couldn't remember where or when. As if the stranger was always there, and yet never really existed. The latest gathering had been no different. The air was thick with the smell of grilled meat, and children ran around with sticky hands, laughing without care. Music played in the background, the kind of cheerful tune that has no meaning but is soothing all the same. I scanned the crowd, my eyes sweeping from one familiar face to the next. Then, there it was again, that same tall figure, standing by the makeshift stage. They hadn't moved, not even an inch, yet they seemed to blend into the background, like a shadow that was always there but never quite noticed. I could feel my heart rate pick up. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. Something in the air felt off. I approached a group of friends, trying to distract myself. "Hey," I said casually, "has anyone seen the stranger this time?" They all looked at me, puzzled expressions flickering across their faces. Then one of them, Sarah, laughed nervously. "What stranger?" "The person who always shows up at these things. They're always in the crowd, but never in the pictures. You know the one." I felt my pulse quicken as their blank stares deepened. No one remembered. Not a single person. And I couldn't tell if that frightened me more or less. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of the figure again, their tall frame barely moving, but something in the posture seemed off. It was almost as though they were waiting for something. I took a deep breath. I had to be imagining things. But why was it always the same person? Why couldn't anyone recall their name? And most importantly, why did I have the sinking feeling that this time was different? The wind had started to pick up as the day wore on. The once comfortable warmth now carried an edge of cold, making me tug my jacket tighter around me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, the strange sensation that I was being watched settling into my bones. I looked again at the tall figure, standing there, unmoving. This time, something else caught my eye, a flicker in the corner of my vision, something just beyond the stranger. Was that a shadow? It seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the figure was casting it deliberately. But no one else seemed to notice. I told myself it was the odd lighting, the way the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just strange shadows and bad lighting. It was as if the stranger was somehow bending the very fabric of the evening around them. "Maybe I'm just tired," I muttered under my breath, trying to shake off the rising unease. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I wasn't tired. My mind was just unsettled. I tried to engage with the others again, making small talk, laughing with Sarah as if nothing was wrong. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that figure. What was it about them? Why did they feel like they were the only thing real in this place, as if everything else was an illusion? It was then that I realized something that made my stomach drop. No one was really looking at them. Everyone was aware of the figure's presence, but no one seemed curious, no one seemed bothered. They weren't even talking about them, not even in passing. It was as if the stranger had been there forever and no one had ever questioned it. It wasn't just the figure. It was the way the people around me were acting, the way their eyes seemed unfocused, their conversations mechanical. They all went about their usual routines, unaware of the tension in the air. I stepped away from the group and made my way towards the edge of the field where the stranger was standing. The closer I got, the more I could feel the cold creeping in, a sudden chill that clung to my skin and left goosebumps in its wake. The music from the stage became muffled, like it was coming from behind a wall. As I neared, I noticed something even more unsettling. The ground beneath my feet had become strangely silent. No crunching of gravel, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just an eerie stillness. I stopped in my tracks. My breathing felt too loud, too quick, cutting through the silence like a knife. I looked up, and for the first time, the stranger turned to face me. Their eyes were hidden beneath the brim of their hat, but their presence was overpowering. I froze, rooted to the spot. There was something about them that was wrong, something that didn't belong here. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, as if I had swallowed something too big to speak past. And then, in the stillness, something whispered through my mind, a voice, not my own, but one I had heard before. It was a fleeting memory, like a half-forgotten dream. You should remember me. I blinked, trying to shake off the strange thought. But it lingered, like an echo. I took a step back, then another, and then another, until I was several feet away. The stranger did not move. They were just standing there, like they had always been. I turned to head back to the group, but the strangest thing happened. As I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. I stopped, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't remember them leaving. I hadn't seen them move at all. And yet, there was no sign of them now, no trace of their presence. Just the empty space where they had stood. I turned around again, scanning the crowd. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. I was about to walk back to Sarah to tell her what had happened, but the air around me felt thick, oppressive, as though it were pressing down on me. I couldn't explain it, but the world around me had shifted. The sounds of laughter, the chatter, even the smell of food, it all felt distant now, as though they were just noises from a dream. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before I lost my grip on reality entirely. But no matter how fast I walked, it felt as though I was going nowhere. The crowd shifted, but the streets never seemed to end. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, and the air became more suffocating. Was this real? Or was I losing my mind? The question gnawed at me, and with it came the sense that something was closing in. The longer I stayed here, the more I could feel it, an encroaching presence that I couldn't escape. I needed to find out who that person was. I had to understand. But something deep inside me whispered that the more I searched for answers, the deeper I would sink into the nightmare. The air was thick with uncertainty, my thoughts spinning wildly as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I walked faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step seemed to carry me further away from the familiar streets and deeper into a place I couldn't recognize. The crowd had thinned out, the once bustling festival now growing quieter, as if the life in the town was slowly seeping away. I glanced around, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might confirm what I was feeling. But the faces that passed by seemed distant, like they were moving in slow motion, their smiles frozen in time. No one seemed to notice that the world was unraveling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and walked toward the small park near the edge of the town. The path was dark now, lit only by the faint glow of a few scattered street lamps. The quiet was deafening, the silence broken only by the distant murmur of voices that seemed too far away to reach. I sat on a bench, my mind racing. What was happening to me? Why did I feel so disconnected from everything? The stranger, there had to be something more to them, something I wasn't seeing. But what? What was I missing? A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, caught my attention. I turned toward the edge of the park, where the trees grew thicker. The noise was like the soft scrape of something dragging across the ground, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a cat. But then the sound grew louder, closer. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the night growing thicker with every passing second. I stood up, my pulse quickening again. It was as if something was watching me from the shadows. The rustling stopped. The silence was complete. And then, from the darkness, something emerged. At first, I couldn't make it out clearly, but as it moved closer, I could see it clearly, a figure, hunched low to the ground, eyes glinting in the dim light. Its body was twisted, unnatural, and it was dragging itself forward with jerky, uncoordinated movements. I stumbled backward, my heart in my throat. What was that? The figure stopped, and for a moment, everything was still again. The world held its breath, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. Then, a voice, soft, distant, whispered through the air. "You're not supposed to remember." My blood ran cold. The words sent a chill through my entire body. I turned quickly, scanning the park for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The rustling had stopped. The figure was gone. Had I imagined it? Was I starting to lose my mind? I didn't know. But the voice, it had been real. It had felt real. I started to walk again, faster now, desperate to find some kind of logic in the madness that was unfolding around me. The town was no longer a place of comfort. It was a maze, each turn leading to a dead end, each corner hiding something that I could never fully understand. The stranger had to be connected to this, to the whispers, to the shadow in the corner of my mind. As I walked down the empty street, I felt the temperature drop further. The silence was unbearable now, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I reached the edge of the town and stopped, staring into the darkness beyond the streetlights. The shadows shifted. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were something more, something with a presence, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And then, through the oppressive quiet, a voice echoed in my mind once more, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right there, in the depths of my own thoughts. "You should have never come looking for me." The voice was low, almost mocking, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the stranger. This was about me. I had seen something that no one was meant to see. I had stepped outside of the line, asked too many questions. And now I was part of something I couldn't escape. I turned, wanting to run, but my legs felt like lead. The air around me thickened, the atmosphere pressing in, suffocating me. And then, a cold breeze swept past me, carrying with it a sickly, metallic smell. I turned to see the shadows at the edge of the park, creeping toward me, coiling like tendrils in the air. It wasn't just the stranger I was running from now. It was everything. Everything I had ever known was slipping away, unraveling at the seams. There was no escape. I felt the cold hand of panic clutch at my chest, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The shadows were growing, swallowing everything around me. The familiar had become alien, twisted beyond recognition. Then, as if from the depths of my own fear, a figure stepped out from the darkness. It was them. the stranger. But they were different now. Their eyes, hidden beneath the brim of their hat, gleamed with an unsettling light, and their smile, it was a smile I had seen before, but not like this. It was too wide, too knowing. "You never should have come looking," they whispered, their voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air. I couldn't speak. My throat had gone dry. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. And then, I understood. The stranger wasn't just a person. They were a part of this place, a part of the darkness that had always been there, waiting. They were the keeper of the truth, the one who made sure no one ever saw what was lurking beneath the surface. And as they took a step closer, I realized the truth too late. I had already become a part of the nightmare. The last thing I saw was the stranger's face, twisted in that same knowing smile, before the world around me dissolved into darkness. I woke to silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, as though the world itself has decided to hold its breath. I couldn't tell where I was at first. Everything was just dark, like a thick fog pressing in from all sides. My body felt heavy, as though I had been dragged through endless miles of cold earth. But when I opened my eyes, the world didn't seem to change. I was still surrounded by shadows, but there was a strange flickering light far off in the distance. It wasn't a light I recognized. It was more like the faintest pulse, like something alive, breathing in the darkness. I tried to move, but the weight on my limbs was suffocating. It felt like my body was tangled in something cold and sticky. I couldn't tell if it was the air itself pressing down on me or if I was caught in some unseen web. I forced myself to sit up, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The events before I lost consciousness were hazy, flashbacks of that stranger, the voice echoing in my mind, the shadows closing in, but none of it made sense anymore. I couldn't understand what was real and what wasn't. The flickering light grew brighter, and something deep within me urged me to move toward it. I had no choice. Something about it felt like the only escape, the only way out of this suffocating nothingness. As I stumbled forward, the world around me seemed to shift again. The shadows, once oppressive and consuming, seemed to part slightly, revealing more of the dark landscape ahead of me. There was something about this place that felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words, a feeling that everything was twisted just out of reach of my comprehension. Then, I saw it. The stranger. They stood at the edge of the light, their silhouette looming like a dark monument in the growing glow. Their figure was taller than I remembered, more imposing, and their eyes, those eyes, burned through the darkness, glowing with an unnatural fire. "You came looking," they said, their voice like a soft whisper that somehow filled the entire space. "You came seeking answers, but you have only found the truth." I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. I felt like I was suffocating, like every breath I took was thicker than the last. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the kind that hangs in a place that's been untouched by light for too long. "You weren't meant to remember," the stranger continued, stepping closer, their presence overwhelming. "The memories were never yours to keep. You've seen too much now, and the price must be paid." My heart raced. The weight of their words pressed down on me, and I tried to push myself back, to escape, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My body felt like it was locked in place, my mind screaming to run but unable to move an inch. "You were never meant to see what lies beneath," the stranger said, their smile widening, sharp and cruel. "This place was never meant to be known. It was always meant to be forgotten." I could feel the world around me closing in, the light growing stronger and the shadows deeper. It was as though the very air itself was made of their words, wrapping around me, pulling me closer to the darkness. And then, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, skittering noise, like something crawling just beyond my vision. It grew louder, faster, until it was all I could hear. My skin prickled, my body stiffened with fear, and I turned, unable to fight the panic surging through me. In the darkness, something moved. Something huge. I saw the first glint of its eyes before I saw its form, a pair of glowing yellow eyes, like twin orbs of malice in the abyss. They stared at me, unblinking, and the thing that they belonged to shifted forward into the light. It was massive, larger than any animal I had ever seen, its grotesque body twisted and contorted like a nightmare made flesh. Its fur was patchy and torn, and its claws scraped the ground with a sharp, bone-chilling sound. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, those eyes, glowing with hunger and malice, like they had been waiting for me all this time. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature, this thing, this horror, was closing in, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. You were warned, the stranger's voice echoed in my mind again, louder now, almost mocking. You weren't supposed to know. But now you'll never forget. The creature's shadow stretched toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was just as much a part of this nightmare as the stranger. And as it lunged toward me, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth that seemed to stretch beyond reason, I realized the truth. There was no escape. Not from the thing in the shadows, and not from the stranger who controlled everything I saw. The last thing I felt before the world plunged into darkness was the overwhelming sense of dread that had been following me all along. The truth wasn't just out of reach. It was buried beneath layers of lies, and once you dug too deep, there was no coming back. The world collapsed into darkness. No light, no sound, only the cold grip of fear that twisted my insides. My heart pounded like a drum, but my body was frozen, unable to move or scream. The moment the creature's jaws snapped shut around me, the world seemed to pause, as if time itself had been stolen away. But there was no pain. No bite, no tearing of flesh. Just an oppressive silence that hung thick in the air, like the universe itself had drawn in a deep, terrible breath. And then, I opened my eyes. I was lying in the middle of a street. The same street. The same town. It felt familiar, too familiar, like I had never left. The night was silent, except for the distant hum of the occasional car. The air smelled like rain, fresh and clean, but there was a strange heaviness to it, a weight that settled in the pit of my stomach. The shadows still clung to the corners of my vision, lurking just out of sight. I sat up slowly, the cold pavement against my palms, the remnants of the night's terror lingering like a fog in my mind. Was it a dream? Had I imagined everything? The stranger, the creature, the darkness, had it all been a figment of my imagination, a nightmare too real to shake off? But then I heard it. A rustling sound. It started as a soft scratch, almost like wind brushing against leaves. But then it grew louder, closer. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that sound. It was the same sound I had heard before, in the park, in the dark, when I had felt the creature's presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I looked up, and there it was again. The figure. The stranger. They stood in front of me, a mere silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlights. Their face was still hidden beneath the brim of their hat, but I could feel their gaze, cold and calculating, piercing through the darkness. There was no smile this time. No comforting expression, just an emptiness, like they had come to collect something that had been promised. "You've returned," they said softly, their voice the same low hum that I remembered, but now it felt final. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. I had seen them, the creature, the shadows. I had been lost in the dark. How could I be here? How could I be back in the same place, the same street? "You're still here," I whispered, my voice hoarse, cracking with disbelief. "I saw you. I saw it all. What happened?" "Yes," the stranger interrupted, their voice growing sharper, more insistent. "You saw what you were never meant to see. And now you are one of us." I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. My mind raced with confusion and panic. I wanted to run, to escape, but something kept me rooted to the ground. The weight of their words pressed down on me, wrapping around me like invisible chains. "You cannot escape," the stranger continued, their tone colder now, "because you have already crossed the line. This place, the town, the people, you are entangled in it now. And you will never truly leave." I shook my head. "No. I can't be part of this. I don't understand. What is this place? What are you?" The stranger's figure shifted, moving closer, and the shadows around them seemed to twist and grow, becoming more alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Their eyes, hidden beneath the brim of their hat, glowed faintly, and for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of understanding. The shadows weren't just shadows. They weren't nothing. They were real, just as real as the town itself, just as real as the strangers that inhabited it. "You are here because you belong here," the stranger whispered, stepping even closer now, so close I could almost feel the chill emanating from their form. "This town exists outside of time, outside of logic. It draws you in when you least expect it. It feeds on your confusion, your fear. And when it is done with you, you will forget. You will forget everything. Your mind will break, and you will vanish." I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my chest. But the creature, I saw it. I saw everything, and it was real. The stranger's eyes gleamed beneath their hat. "Real?" they echoed, their voice laced with a dark amusement. "What is real, then? The world you think you know? The world you can touch, see, and feel? Or is it the world that lurks beneath? The one you can't understand, the one you can't escape? The one that is already inside of you?" I shook my head violently, trying to tear the truth from my mind. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't believe that this town, this nightmare, was all I would ever know from now on. "You can try to run," the stranger said, their voice softening, almost tender. "But there's no point. There is nowhere left for you to go." And as they said this, the air around me thickened, the darkness grew heavier. I could feel it, closing in from all sides. The creature's shadow, the presence of something ancient and malevolent, was coming closer again. I closed my eyes, clutching my head as my mind spiraled. The shadows twisted into monstrous forms, their whispers becoming louder until the world itself became a cacophony of deafening noise. I tried to push it all away, but it was too much. My body trembled uncontrollably as the weight of reality shattered around me. And then, everything stopped. The noise. The darkness. The weight. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in the middle of the street. The town was silent. Empty. It felt familiar in a way that I couldn't explain, but the people were gone. The life, the sounds of a bustling town, were gone. Only the shadows remained. The shadows that watched. And as I stood there, the final piece clicked into place. I had become one of them. The town had claimed me. I was now a part of its endless loop. A part of the shadows that roamed its streets, forgotten by time, by memory, by everything. The world had broken, and I had broken with it. I was lost. Forever. Underground world. It was just another night shift. The air was thick with the smell of old rust and sweat, the hum of distant machinery, a constant reminder that the underground world of New York City was always alive, even in the dead of night. I had worked here for years, cleaning, fixing tracks, making sure the trains ran smoothly, but something felt off tonight. Something in the air made my skin crawl. I was a simple worker, never one to get caught up in ghost stories or the eerie tales that often circulated among the crew. But tonight, as I walked deeper into the shadowy tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The usual noises, the clanging of tools, the low murmur of voices, seemed distant, as if they were being swallowed up by the darkness. Only the sound of my boots echoing against the cold, concrete walls kept me company. It started with a faint rustle. At first, I thought it was just a rat, a typical sight around these parts. But then it came again. A sound like the dragging of something heavy across the floor. I froze. The tunnel around me felt too quiet. Too empty. I had been down here countless times, but never had it felt so wrong. The sound wasn't the usual scurrying of rodents, and it certainly wasn't the wind. It came from much closer than that. It was deliberate, slow, like something was stalking me. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from up ahead. The dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse quicken. No one else was supposed to be down here at this hour. Just me and the tracks. Another rustle. This time, it was louder. Closer. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was then that I noticed something I had missed before. There were small, muddy paw prints on the floor, leading toward the next tunnel. They were too large to be from the usual rats, and their shape was wrong. I stepped closer, examining the trail. The prints were fresh, the mud still damp. They didn't look like the marks of any animal I had seen down here. They were too deep, too large. I felt a cold sweat bead on my forehead as I took a step back. Suddenly, a flash of movement. The shadow of something large, something quick, darted across the edge of my vision. My heart slammed into my chest as I instinctively reached for my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness in front of me. But all I saw was the wall. Nothing there. Get it together, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I needed to finish my rounds, check the tracks, and head back. But the deeper I went into the tunnel, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. The light from my flashlight seemed to grow weaker, the shadows stretching and creeping as though they were alive, following me. I could hear the faint sound of scratching now. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Like something was digging into the concrete, making its way closer. I turned sharply, aiming the flashlight into the dark. Nothing. I turned around, and there it was again, a quick rustle, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws clicking on the stone. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, shining the light directly into the corner, where I could just make out a shape, a large, dark figure crouching low. Its eyes reflected the light, two glowing orbs in the murkiness of the tunnel. My heart skipped a beat. A rat. But it wasn't like any rat I had ever seen. This thing was massive, its fur matted and filthy, its body far too large for the cramped space. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, and as it stared at me, I felt a chill spread through my bones. I stumbled backward, my foot hitting something hard. The sound echoed in the tunnel, and for a brief moment, I thought I had startled the creature into retreat. But no! It didn't move. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears, my mind racing. What was it doing? Why wasn't it running? Why was it staring at me? And then, I heard it. A second rustle. Not from the creature, but from behind it. More rustling, louder now, like an entire army of something large moving toward me in the darkness. I snapped my flashlight to the other side of the tunnel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. There, just out of sight, were more of them. Dozens, maybe more. Their eyes glowed, flashing in the darkness, their silhouettes taking form in the shadows. My mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Giant rats? Was I hallucinating? I had to be. I spun around and ran. I didn't care about the tracks or the job I was supposed to finish. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there, getting back to the light, to the safety of the surface. I heard them behind me, the scratching growing louder, the patter of many feet chasing me down the tunnel. The fear in my chest was a physical thing now, a heavy weight pushing me forward. The light from my flashlight bobbed in front of me, but it wasn't enough. The creatures were closing in. I could hear them breathing, their heavy, wet breathing, like 100 rats all gasping for air at once. I could hear their claws, scraping against the stone, growing louder with every step. And then, I saw it, a flicker of light up ahead. The stairs. The entrance. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The darkness seemed to swallow everything behind me, but I knew they were there. I knew they were coming. I reached the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted upward. I made it to the surface, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. I turned around, looking down into the tunnel. Nothing. It was quiet now. Too quiet. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew that whatever it wasn't just the rats. There was something much worse lurking beneath the city, something that I had just barely escaped. And I wasn't sure if I'd be so lucky the next time. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every sound, every flicker of light, made my heart race. The subway cars seemed quieter, and the bustling crowds above ground did nothing to calm the gnawing sensation that something was waiting for me just beneath the surface. I couldn't stop thinking about the glowing eyes in the darkness. The sheer size of those creatures. I should have been relieved to escape, but all I could feel was dread. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I was just overworked. Maybe I had been hearing things. The long hours underground could mess with your mind, and I'd been down there for days, fixing rails and wiring. But deep down, I knew better. That wasn't just my imagination. I had seen them. As I walked to the subway station that morning, I couldn't help but glance nervously at the stairs leading down to the platform. The darkness felt different now, more alive. The usual hum of the city seemed muffled, and the very air felt thick with a weight I couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to focus. I needed to get to work. I needed to act normal. But the moment I stepped onto the train, the discomfort returned. The metal walls felt too close. The air too stale. The train lurched forward, and I felt the familiar rush of motion, but the unease in my chest only grew. A few stops into the ride, I noticed something strange. There was a new smell, something sickly sweet, like rotting meat. The passengers around me didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they were too absorbed in their phones or the dull hum of the train to care. But I couldn't ignore it. It clung to the air, seeping into my lungs, filling my head with a nauseating pressure. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to suppress the urge to gag. I shifted in my seat, feeling an itch at the back of my neck. Was someone watching me? I looked around quickly, but there was no one. The train was practically empty, a few stragglers sitting near the doors. I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. The doors slid open, and I stepped off onto the platform. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The tunnels greeted me with their familiar chill, but today they felt even colder, darker. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I quickened my pace, heading toward the maintenance tunnel where I had seen those awful creatures the night before. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but certainly not this. There were signs of activity. Scratches on the walls. Claw marks deep in the concrete, like something had tried to burrow its way through. A trail of muddy paw prints. Larger than any rat prints I had ever seen. I hesitated, my mind racing. This was too much. I was only supposed to check the tracks and report back. But something deep inside me urged me to keep going. To find out what was happening. I didn't know what I was hoping for, some rational explanation, some sign that everything I had seen was just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something down here, something ancient and hungry. I stepped forward cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tunnel stretched out before me, silent and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like the rustling of paper. The walls seemed to close in around me as the noise grew louder, sharper. It was unmistakable now, scraping. Something large moving through the tunnel. Something closer than I wanted it to be. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The tunnel was empty. I was alone. But the sound kept coming. It was almost as if it was following me. The cold sweat began to bead on my forehead as I turned back to the path ahead, my mind spinning with panic. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a pipe. Maybe it was just the wind. The tunnels weren't always stable. But deep down, I knew what it was. And then, it happened again, the flicker of movement in the shadows, just outside the beam of my flashlight. I stepped back quickly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The light flickered again, and this time I saw it clearly. A shape, low to the ground, moving in the dark. Something huge, its body crouched low, its eyes reflecting the light. Not one, but two. No, more than two. They were coming. I froze, unable to move as I watched the creatures emerge from the shadows. They were like nothing I had ever seen before. Their bodies were twisted, their fur matted and crawling with filth. Their eyes glowed in the dark, sharp and cold, reflecting back at me like a predator's gaze. And their mouths were filled with rows of jagged teeth, each one glistening in the dim light. The scraping sound grew louder as more of them emerged, their massive bodies moving in unison. They were circling me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as their eyes locked onto mine. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, locked in some horrible trance as the creatures drew closer. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Wet and labored, like something taking its time, savoring the moment before the kill. It was then that I realized. They weren't just rats. They were something worse. Something that had been living in the darkness for far longer than anyone knew. They had been waiting for this moment, for someone foolish enough to wander too far into their territory. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted with terror. And just as one of the creatures lunged forward, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a sudden pressure, like the world was closing in on me. The darkness swallowed everything. The light. The sound. The fear. Then, there was nothing. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time felt irrelevant when you were lying in the darkness, your mind swimming in a haze of confusion. My body ached as I struggled to regain my senses, but the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was the same sickly sweet rot I had smelled on the train, only now it was stronger. It filled my nostrils, churning my stomach as I fought to open my eyes. When I finally managed to peel my eyelids apart, the world around me was blurred. My vision came back slowly, like I was waking up from a nightmare that I couldn't quite escape. The ceiling above me was low, the walls pressing in on all sides. I was still in the tunnel, but it wasn't the same. The place had changed. The walls were slick with something dark and wet. There were strange markings etched into the concrete, symbols I didn't recognize, twisted and jagged. I sat up, my head spinning. I was alive, somehow. But what had happened? The last thing I remembered, the creatures. The claws. The eyes. Had they attacked me? I felt a sharp pain in my side as I tried to move, and when I touched it, my hand came away sticky with blood. My heart pounded in my chest, fear flooding back as I realized how close I had come to dying. But there was no time to panic. I needed to get out of here. I tried to stand, my legs weak, and stumbled to my feet, pressing my back against the cold wall for support. I shuddered as the familiar scrape of claws echoed down the tunnel, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a voice. A low, guttural whisper. I turned, but again, there was nothing. Just the darkness, stretching endlessly before me. I stumbled forward, each step echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The pain in my side was sharp, but it wasn't the worst thing. No, it was the gnawing feeling in the back of my mind that kept whispering to me. Something was wrong. The air felt thicker now, heavier, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. The more I walked, the more I realized how twisted everything had become. The tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, the lights flickering in and out like dying stars. I looked back once, but the path I had come from had disappeared. There was no sign of where I had been, no sign of the creatures, no sign of my escape. It was as if the tunnel had swallowed it all. I pressed on, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't remember how long I had been down here. Had I been unconscious for hours? Days? I had to find a way out. I had to get back to the surface. But the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The walls seemed to close in on me. The air felt suffocating. And that sound, that scraping, it was closer now. It followed me, growing louder with every step, as if the creatures were closing in again. I didn't know how long I could keep running. I didn't know how long I could stay sane. The tunnel twisted again, and I found myself standing in a wide chamber, its walls slick with something dark. The ceiling arched overhead, impossibly high, and in the center of the room was a massive pit. The air smelled of decay, of rot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the depths. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the darkness of the pit. There was something moving down there. Something huge. I saw flashes of glowing eyes, like distant stars, flickering in the blackness. But the eyes weren't the worst part. It was the sound. The scraping noise had turned into a chorus of gnashing, of scraping against bone, of something ancient and hungry. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the abyss, knowing that whatever was down there, it had been waiting for me. Waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too far into the darkness. And then, from the depths, a voice. It wasn't human. It was something older, something that didn't belong in this world. Come closer. I could feel my heart stop in my chest as the voice echoed around me, bouncing off the walls of the chamber. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I took a step back, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. Come closer. You are one of us now. I shook my head, my body trembling. No. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't one of them. I wasn't like the others. But my body didn't listen. My legs moved against my will, drawn toward the edge of the pit. My feet carried me closer, one step at a time, as if I was being pulled by invisible strings. The creatures. The rats. They were in the darkness, waiting for me. They were the ones controlling me. Their eyes locked onto mine, glowing with that cold, inhuman hunger. I tried to scream, to fight, but my voice was lost in the silence. A hand, no, a claw, shot out of the darkness, grabbing me by the arm and dragging me toward the edge of the pit. My skin burned where it touched, and the voice in my head screamed louder. Join us. I struggled, my body fighting against its own will, but the creature's grip was too strong. I could feel my thoughts slipping away, like sand through my fingers. The world around me twisted, and I knew then that there was no escaping. I had become one of them. My fingers clawed at the edge of the pit, but the dark force pulling me was stronger. I felt my body moving against my will, dragged by unseen hands, a part of something far larger than myself. My mind screamed, my body fought, but I couldn't stop it. The pit was vast, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch forever, and the creatures were emerging from its depths. Their glowing eyes shimmered like stars in the pitch blackness, and their bodies twisted and shifted, becoming something beyond comprehension. They weren't just rats. They weren't just creatures of the underworld. They were something ancient, something malevolent, and they were all around me, closing in. The voices whispered in my mind, louder now, and the cold grip of fear clenched tighter around my chest. The creatures' whispers were no longer just words, they were commands. Join us, they hissed in unison. You are one of us. You belong here. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I couldn't fight them. I could feel my mind slipping, my thoughts distorting, and a cold numbness began to seep into my limbs. My body moved without my permission, my feet stepping forward, my hands reaching out toward the pit. The darkness was alive, and I was falling into it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free. But the force pulling me down was too much. My body, my soul, everything was succumbing to it. I could feel the creatures watching, their breath heavy and warm against my skin as they closed in. Their eyes never left me, glowing, watching as I teetered on the edge of the abyss. I could hear the scraping sound again, now deafening, like claws scraping across the stone floor, each stroke of the noise sending shivers of panic through my body. I could feel their claws on my skin now, their grip tightening, and I realized with sickening clarity that it wasn't just the creatures, there were more, something deeper within the pit. I was not alone. The creatures began to chant, their voices swirling together in a maddening rhythm, urging me to give in. You are one of us now. You are one of us. The whispers grew louder, more demanding. It felt like my mind was being shredded, my thoughts splintering under the weight of their commands. I was losing myself, and I couldn't stop it. The darkness around me pressed in, thick and suffocating. I could feel my identity slipping away, piece by piece. Then, just as I thought I would lose myself entirely, I felt something cold and sharp, something metallic, against my chest. It was an abrupt and jarring sensation, like the sudden sting of ice against skin. My heart skipped a beat, and for a fleeting moment, the world around me stopped. I looked down, confused, and saw the glint of a strange, jagged object buried deep in my chest. A shard of metal, a twisted piece of scrap from the tunnels themselves, embedded into my flesh. The pain was blinding, but in that moment, it was the only thing that felt real. It hurt. It hurt like nothing I ever felt before, but it was grounding. It pulled me out of the suffocating darkness for just a moment. I gasped for air, struggling to regain control of my mind. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't become one of them. I pushed against the darkness, against the creatures pulling me, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left. My mind was a haze of terror and confusion, but I fought against the tide. The creatures screeched in fury, their voices shrill and high-pitched, as they clawed at me, trying to drag me back into the pit. But I held on, gripping the shard of metal in my chest with everything I had. The pain, though unbearable, was a lifeline. It kept me from losing myself completely. And then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A distant rumble. A faint thud. The ground beneath me trembled, and the creatures paused, their glowing eyes shifting in alarm. Something was coming. Something was breaking through the dark. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was salvation or destruction. But it was coming. The rumble grew louder, shaking the very foundation of the tunnel. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. The abyss was still, its hunger momentarily stilled. I could barely breathe, my chest heaving with the effort. The shard of metal embedded in me felt like it was burning through my ribs, but somehow it was keeping me anchored to reality. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, and I could feel it watching me. The whispers had ceased, but the silence was even more terrifying than the noise. Then, the rumble intensified, and the ground cracked open beneath me. A jagged fissure spread wide, sending a burst of freezing air into the cavern. Someone was coming. I could see shadows moving at the edge of the darkness, shapes that were larger than life, too large to be anything human. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was emerging from the deep, but I couldn't help myself. Through the crack, I saw them. Figures, towering and dark, stepping through the fissure with a slow, deliberate grace. They weren't human. Their forms were grotesque, writhing in unnatural ways, their limbs too long, their faces hidden behind cloaks of shadow. The air around them shimmered with an unnatural energy, crackling like static. The creatures, those ancient, twisted beings that had surrounded me, recoiled. I could feel their fear now, an overwhelming wave of it, as they scuttled back into the shadows, their glowing eyes dimming. But it wasn't just fear. It was something worse, something I couldn't quite understand. Desperation. Panic. They were terrified of these beings. And I was too. I should have run. I should have turned and fled. But my legs were frozen. The world had turned into a blur of shapes and darkness, and the metal shard was now a dull, throbbing ache in my chest. The figures advanced. They did not speak, but their presence alone filled the space with an oppressive weight. The tunnel felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in. The creatures, who had once ruled the darkness, were now retreating like rats scurrying into the corners. The largest figure, one whose height seemed to stretch beyond reason, stopped in front of me. Its presence consumed the very air around it, and I could feel my chest tighten as if the weight of its gaze was pressing on me from all sides. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that reverberated through my bones. "You are not one of them," it said. "But you will be." The words chilled me to the core. I didn't know if it was a warning or a promise. The darkness closed in again. The creatures were circling now, their eyes glowing with a renewed hunger. The whispers returned, but they were different this time. They were not just trying to claim me anymore, they were begging me to join them, to give in to the power of the abyss. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was creeping in. I wasn't going to let them win. I had already fought too hard to be consumed now. But my strength was fading. The shard of metal in my chest was pulling at me, drawing me toward the pit. The creature's whispers were now one with the voice of the towering figure before me, urging me, commanding me to step into the darkness. I took a deep breath. My eyes flicked to the creatures retreating into the shadows, and I realized something. This wasn't about survival anymore. This wasn't about escaping. It never had been. It was about choice. I wasn't just trapped in a tunnel. I was trapped in my mind, caught between two worlds. I was a prisoner of the darkness, just like they were. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to keep my humanity, I had to make a choice. I turned toward the towering figure, meeting its gaze, and I spoke with the last bit of strength I had left. I choose to fight. The ground trembled, and the shadows exploded around me. The creatures screamed in fury, but their cries were drowned out by the deafening roar that came from the abyss. The fissure widened, and the darkness seemed to collapse in on itself. The towering figure's eyes flared bright, and in that instant, everything stopped. I felt the presence of something ancient and terrifying, something beyond comprehension. The power that had gripped me, gripped all of us, was now being torn apart. But it wasn't over. The world went black. Fog Station. It was just another ordinary evening in the small, forgotten town of Clearwater. The kind of place where trains come and go, their tracks stretching out like veins, connecting the town to the world outside. I had worked here as a station master for the past 5 years. The familiar rhythm of the trains, the predictable hum of the engines, had always given me a sense of purpose. It was a simple life, until the fog arrived. It began with a strange mist that rolled in one Tuesday evening just after the last train of the day had passed. The weather reports hadn't predicted it, and no one could explain where it had come from. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, after the trains departed, the station would be filled with the sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional distant whistle of another train passing through the town. But that night, the air was still. The world felt suffocatingly quiet. The fog was thick. It didn't roll in slowly, like you'd expect from a natural weather event. No, it was sudden. 1 minute, the station was clear, and the next, the mist was so dense you could barely see your hand in front of your face. The lamps around the station flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground, and I could hear the soft murmur of the fog as though it was alive. I stood at the window of the station house, watching it. It wasn't right. The mist wasn't just fog, it was something else. Something unnatural. I had no explanation for it, but I could feel its presence, creeping closer, enveloping the station. Then, the first disappearance occurred. It was near midnight when I received a call from the night watchman. His voice was trembling, barely audible over the crackling line. He had seen something strange, he said. Figures moving through the fog. But they weren't like any normal people. No, these figures were wrong. Tall, thin shapes that moved like shadows, their outlines flickering in and out of view. He said they were coming from the tracks. I couldn't believe it. I told him to stay inside and lock the doors, but the connection cut out before he could respond. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the mist. I told myself it was just his imagination, that maybe he'd seen a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew something was off. As I stepped out onto the platform, the air felt thick, like I was breathing through a damp cloth. The flashlight beam cut through the fog, but only a few feet in front of me. The rest was swallowed up by the dense, swirling mist. The soft hiss of the fog around me was the only sound I could hear. I started walking toward the tracks. The train station was silent, no signs of life anywhere. The ground felt different under my feet, soft, almost spongy, like the earth itself was soaked in moisture. The light from the station lamps barely reached the rails, and the rest of the world beyond the tracks was consumed by the fog. As I walked closer to the edge of the platform, I felt a cold shiver down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stopped in my tracks and listened carefully. Nothing. No sounds. No footsteps. No wind. Then, the unmistakable noise. A faint, skittering sound, like tiny claws tapping on the ground. It came from the direction of the tracks. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound grew louder. It was coming closer, the tapping unmistakably rhythmic. It wasn't a mouse or a rat, I knew that. This sound was different. Bigger. Something far larger was out there, moving in the mist. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the fog, looking for the source. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. But none came. The sound grew louder. Closer. I knew I had to leave. My legs moved on their own, backing away slowly, but then I heard something else. A low growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through the mist. It sent a wave of terror through me, freezing me in place. That was when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, stepped out of the fog. Its face was obscured, but I could see its eyes, red and gleaming, like two burning coals. Its body was unnaturally long, with arms that reached the ground, dragging as it moved. It wasn't human. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, paralyzed by fear as the creature slowly advanced toward me. It moved silently, its limbs twitching unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. The growl came again, louder this time, and I felt the ground tremble beneath me. In that moment, I knew this was no natural fog. It wasn't just some strange weather phenomenon. It was something else. Something alive. And it was hunting us. The creature was closer now. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, everything else in the world disappeared. There was only the creature and me, alone in the mist. I took one step back, then another, and in that moment, I made a decision. I turned and ran, not caring about anything but getting away. The sound of its growl followed me, echoing through the fog, and I knew I wasn't safe, not yet. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the station house, panting and wide-eyed, my heart racing. But when I looked around, I saw no sign of the creature. The mist had swallowed it up, and the night was silent once again. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that it was just the fog playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and what I had heard. I wasn't alone anymore. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something far worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur. After the terrifying encounter with whatever that creature was, the town was on edge. The fog didn't dissipate. It lingered, hanging like a heavy curtain over Clearwater, and each day it seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The next morning, I reported what had happened to the sheriff, but his reaction was less than reassuring. He chalked it up to a wild imagination, a product of exhaustion, or maybe even the stress of working late in the fog. He told me I needed to get some rest and that the fog was just a natural anomaly, probably caused by the temperature drop. He dismissed my fears like they were nothing more than a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen. The growl. The eyes. The unnatural way that thing moved. I couldn't explain it, and no amount of logic could convince me otherwise. That night, the fog was even thicker than before. I stood in the station, watching the swirling mist outside, feeling that same cold shiver crawl up my spine. The silence was unnerving, and I kept hearing that soft scratching noise, like something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the fog, moving around in the shadows. Every time I tried to shake the feeling off, it returned, more intense than before. I wasn't the only one who had been affected. Over the past few days, the train schedules had started to get disrupted. More and more passengers were reporting delays, sometimes even missing trains entirely. But the most disturbing reports came from people who had traveled through the fog. They spoke of seeing strange figures in the mist, of hearing footsteps that didn't belong to anyone they could see, and of a constant, nagging feeling that they were being followed. One of the engineers from the local train yard disappeared that afternoon. He'd been sent to check the tracks, and when he didn't return after an hour, they sent someone after him. He was found at the edge of the station, frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at something in the distance, mumbling incoherently. His clothes were torn, and his hands were covered in deep scratches, scratches that weren't from any animal. The most chilling part? His mouth was covered in blood. The sheriff still refused to take any action. He believed it was just some kind of freak accident. A wild animal, maybe, or a result of the weather. But every instinct I had screamed that this was something far worse. I found myself growing more and more obsessed with the fog. Every time I walked through it, every time I stood by the station, the feeling that I wasn't alone would claw at my insides. I could hear whispers, just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the mist, a shadow darting across the corner of my vision. But when I turned, nothing was there. That night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the fog, flashlight in hand. I told myself I had to know what was going on. I had to see if there was something out there, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The air felt colder tonight, and the fog was so thick I could barely see the beam of my flashlight. I walked carefully toward the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step seemed to echo in the empty space, louder than it should have been. And the whispers, they were back. Faint, like distant voices calling my name. But I couldn't tell if they were real or if they were just the wind. I paused at the edge of the platform, staring out into the mist. The station was dead silent. No trains, no footsteps, no sound of life. Just the oppressive stillness of the fog. I took a deep breath and walked toward the edge of the tracks. The sound of my boots on the wooden planks was the only thing breaking the silence. The fog seemed to press in on me, its dense, with tendrils curling around my legs, slowing me down. I was halfway to the crossing when I saw it. A shadow moved within the fog. At first, it was small, just a blur of motion, but then it grew. A figure, tall and thin, its outline indistinct against the mist. My heart leapt into my throat as it came closer. I could hear it now, the low, guttural growl, like a warning, like something far too dangerous to ignore. I stood frozen in place, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure wasn't moving like a person. It moved erratically, its limbs jerking, dragging along the ground like something not quite alive. It had no face, just a dark, empty void where its head should be. But those eyes, they gleamed, bright and red, like burning embers. It was close now, so close I could smell the damp earth, the rot of something that had been dead far too long. It reached out toward me, its long, clawed hands scraping across the ground. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice had betrayed me, paralyzed by fear. All I could do was watch as it drew closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood still, just outside the range of my flashlight, staring at me. The growl stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I took one step back, then another, my breath shallow, my legs shaking. I had to get away. I turned and ran. The fog seemed to close in on me, swallowing everything in its path as I sprinted back toward the station. I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me, and I knew it was following me, just out of sight, moving with the same unnatural rhythm. I burst into the station house, slamming the door behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. I leaned against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest, gasping for breath. But as the minutes ticked by, the sounds of the mist outside seemed to grow louder. The whispers, the scratching, the growls, they were all closing in. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold out. The fog wasn't just a weather pattern. It was something alive. Something that was hunting us. And I feared that soon we would all be lost. The night stretched on in agonizing silence. The fog outside the station pressed against the walls like a living thing, as if it were trying to force its way in. My breath still came in short gasps, my chest tightening with every minute that passed. The unsettling sound of shuffling footsteps and distant growls never seemed to fade. I pressed my back against the door, heart racing, trying to convince myself that I was safe, at least for now. But I knew better. The creature was out there, waiting. And it wasn't alone. I turned away from the door, my eyes darting around the station house. I needed to think, to understand what was happening before it was too late. The sheriff had dismissed my concerns, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut that we were dealing with something far beyond any natural explanation. The people who had disappeared, the engineer, the passengers, had all vanished after encountering the fog. It wasn't just bad luck. It was something deliberate. Something evil. I paced back and forth, trying to piece everything together, but the fear gnawing at my mind was starting to cloud my thoughts. The whispers, the shadows, the unearthly growl of the creature, it was all connected. The fog, the disappearances, the terror that seemed to seep from the very air, it wasn't a coincidence. The fog itself was part of it. I just didn't know how. A sudden noise broke through my thoughts, a low scratching sound, like claws scraping against the wood. My head snapped toward the window. I strained my eyes, trying to peer through the mist. And then, I saw it. A shadow, dark against the swirling fog, moved past the window. It was too tall, too angular to be human. My pulse quickened. Whatever was out there was circling, watching. I rushed to the back of the station, grabbing the old hunting rifle that had been left behind by the previous station master. It wasn't much, but it was something. I tried to steady my trembling hands as I checked the chamber. One shot, maybe two. If I was lucky, I might be able to scare it off, at least long enough to make a run for it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough. I had no idea what I was dealing with. It was too big, too powerful. And as I stepped toward the front door again, a horrifying realization hit me. This was just the beginning. The fog was spreading. And with it, the creatures. I heard a scream, short and sharp, coming from the direction of the tracks. I froze, the sound echoing in the mist. A man's voice. No, not just a man, someone from the town. I recognized it, though it was muffled by the fog. The desperation in the scream sent a chill through my spine. There was no mistaking it. Someone else was out there, and they were in trouble. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, flinging it open and stepping into the fog. It closed around me like a suffocating shroud. The darkness seemed to bend and twist, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The shadows between the trees and the street lamps stretched unnaturally long, as though they were waiting to grab me, to pull me into the depths of the mist. I ignored the fear clawing at my insides. The scream had sounded close. I had to find them. I stumbled forward, the flashlight in my hand casting a weak beam of light into the fog. The air felt thick, pressing against me like a wall. Each step was slow, calculated, as if the fog itself was resisting me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't just let someone else be taken by whatever this thing was. The screams grew louder as I pushed on. There was no mistaking it now. It was someone running, someone terrified, someone who had seen the thing I'd seen. The growls in the distance intensified, echoing like thunder through the fog. And then, I saw them. A figure, silhouetted against the mist, was running toward me. I raised my flashlight, calling out to them, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it just kept running, faster now, panicked. I stepped forward, raising my rifle, when something in the mist shifted. Another shape, darker and far larger, emerged from the shadows, moving toward the running figure. My heart stopped. It wasn't human. The thing was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, hunched over with long, gangly limbs. Its skin was mottled and gray, patches of fur clinging to its body like it had been scavenged from something else. Its head was nearly featureless, save for 2 glowing red eyes that locked onto mine. The man ahead of me didn't stand a chance. The creature moved with terrifying speed, reaching out and grabbing him with an almost casual swiftness. He screamed, a scream that sent a jolt of ice through my veins, but it was quickly cut off, replaced by a sickening sound of tearing and gnawing. I couldn't just stand there, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature turned toward me then, its eyes burning through the mist, and it slowly started to approach. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the rifle and fired, but the shot missed, disappearing into the fog with a hollow crack. It barely seemed to notice. It was almost as if it were playing with me, testing me. The growl that rumbled in its chest was deafening, and as it advanced, I knew there was no escaping it. The fog had become its domain, and in here, I was nothing more than prey. I backed away slowly, my fingers trembling as I tried to reload the rifle. But before I could manage, something grabbed my arm from behind, yanking me into the mist. The creature's growl filled the air, and then, silence. I don't know how long I was out. My head throbbed, and the world around me spun in an unrelenting haze. At first, I thought it was just the fog pressing in, but the disorienting sensation deepened, making it clear I had been knocked unconscious. My breath came in ragged gasps as I forced my eyes open, the fog swirling around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I was lying on the ground, my cheek pressed against something cold and damp. A hard surface, like stone. I tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it as pain shot through my skull. The headache was unbearable, and I groaned in response. But there was no time to rest. The creature was still out there. I could hear it moving through the mist, its growls growing closer. A low, predatory sound that made my skin crawl. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as they touched the cold stone beneath me. The ground was uneven, like I had fallen into a tunnel. I looked around, squinting through the fog. The faint glow of red eyes still lingered in my mind, but there was nothing visible now. I was alone, or at least it seemed that way. Panic surged again as I realized I wasn't sure where I was. The station was nowhere in sight, and I could no longer hear the sound of the tracks or the distant whine of the trains. It was as if the world had swallowed me whole. This wasn't the town I knew. The stone walls that surrounded me didn't look natural. It felt as though I had stumbled into some underground labyrinth, a forgotten place built long before anyone thought to remember it. I staggered to my feet, trying to orient myself. My legs were weak, and the fog was so thick it felt as though I was walking underwater. Every step echoed in the hollow, oppressive silence that surrounded me. And then, a faint whisper, a murmur in the mist, caught my attention. It was a voice, distant yet unmistakable. "Help, please, someone." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was a woman's voice. It sounded so close, and yet the fog made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I strained my ears, trying to hear more, but the voice had faded, replaced by the soft, eerie shuffle of something moving in the dark. Was it another victim? Or worse, was it the creature imitating the voice of the lost? The thought made my stomach turn. "Stay focused," I muttered to myself. My hand reached for the rifle slung over my shoulder, but it was gone. Panic clawed at me. The gun had disappeared, as though the fog had stolen it away. I cursed under my breath. Without it, I was defenseless. I needed to find my bearings, find some way out of this nightmare. The whisper came again, louder this time, desperate. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed through the thick fog, each step feeling heavier, as though the air itself was working against me. The fog seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. It wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a presence. And that presence was closing in on me. The whispering voice turned into a pleading cry, more urgent now. I broke into a run, trying to follow the sound, but it was as if the fog itself was changing direction, shifting around me. Every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound would shift, just out of reach. I stumbled, the ground uneven beneath me, my breath coming in frantic gasps. And then, in a flash, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the fog, just ahead. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes torn. She was staring straight at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "Help me," she whispered, her voice rasping as though it came from far away. I reached for her, but she didn't move. I could hear her breathing now, shallow and labored. There was something wrong about her presence, a coldness that made the air feel even thicker. Her face was too still, too lifeless. Before I could react, the ground trembled beneath my feet, and a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberated through the stone walls. The woman's eyes flickered, and for a split second, they glowed red, just like the creature's. My blood ran cold. "Get away from her," I screamed, but it was too late. The creature lunged out of the fog, massive and hulking, its twisted limbs snapping with unnatural speed. The woman, if that's what she had been, disappeared into the mist, her body disintegrating into shadow as if it had never been there at all. I barely had time to react before the creature grabbed me, its claws scraping against my chest. The stench of decay and rot overwhelmed me as it lifted me into the air, its growl echoing in my ears. I kicked, scratched, but it was useless. Its grip tightened, and I felt myself being pulled into the fog, dragged away from any chance of escape. And then I heard the sound that would haunt me forever, the soft crunch of bone beneath its teeth. I screamed, but the fog swallowed it, and then, nothing. I don't know how long I hung there, suspended in the fog, a captive to the creature's unyielding grasp. My vision blurred, the world spinning as my body was pressed against something cold and unyielding, the creature's claws digging into me like talons. Every breath I took seemed to vanish in the thick, suffocating air. The fog was no longer just a physical presence, it was an entity, alive with malice, choking me with its weight. I thought I was going to die there, in the heart of the fog, at the mercy of whatever nightmare had claimed this place. But then, a strange thing happened. The creature paused. Its grip loosened slightly, and for the first time, I could hear its breathing, deep, labored, as though it was struggling with something beyond its control. And then it released me. I fell to the ground, crashing against the cold, damp stone with a sickening thud. I gasped, my ribs aching as I struggled to breathe. I didn't know why it had let me go, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and trembling. The world around me was spinning, the fog swirling with an unnatural force, as if it was alive and closing in. The creature's growl rumbled in the distance, but it was different now. There was a crackling sound in the air, like static, and the growl shifted into something far more unsettling, human. A voice, distorted and guttural, whispered my name. Adam. I froze. It couldn't be. I had to be hearing things. My mind was playing tricks on me. Adam, The voice repeated, this time closer, much closer. The growl was gone, replaced by a soft, unsettling rustle, like something moving through the fog. My legs were weak, but I forced myself to stand, trying to regain my balance. My heart raced, my hands slick with sweat as I turned toward the sound. I couldn't see it, couldn't see anything, but I knew it was there, just out of reach. It was coming for me. Adam, the voice spoke again, clearer now. And with that clarity came a chilling realization: it wasn't the creature. It wasn't the woman I had seen, or the voices I had heard before. It was my own voice, distorted, echoing from somewhere deep within the fog. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The world around me felt as though it was closing in. The fog was no longer just a physical thing, it was alive, a part of me, wrapping itself around my mind, pulling at my thoughts, at my very soul. I had to get out. I had to leave before it consumed me entirely. I turned and ran, my legs moving faster than they had ever moved before, but the fog was relentless. Every step I took, it seemed to stretch further, pulling me deeper into its depths. The air grew colder, and the sounds grew louder, the rustle of claws, the soft scrape of stone on stone, the whispers, and then, from somewhere in the distance, the soft, unmistakable sound of a train whistle. I froze again. The sound was so familiar, so comforting in the midst of this nightmare. The train. It was coming. But where? And why? I looked around, desperate, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that wasn't fog. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. A single beam of light cutting through the fog like a sword, its glow flickering like a distant star. I could hear the rumble of the train's engine, its rhythmic churning growing louder with each passing second. It was real. It had to be. The train was coming to save me. I began to move toward it, stumbling, my feet barely finding purchase in the shifting fog. The light grew closer, and with it, the sounds, the clatter of wheels on tracks, the steady beat of the engine. But as I drew nearer, I felt something shift in the air. The fog seemed to part just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the train. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The train was massive, its blackened carriages stretching endlessly into the darkness. Its windows were dark, but through the fog, I could see shapes moving inside, shapes that shouldn't have been there. Figures twisted and malformed, their faces obscured by shadows. The light of the train illuminated the mist in a sickly yellow hue, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. The whistle sounded again, this time sharper, more urgent. And then, as the train came closer, I saw it, the creature, standing at the front of the train, its eyes glowing like burning embers. It was waiting for me. I could feel its presence, looming behind me, its breath hot against my neck. But I couldn't stop. I had to reach the train. I had to escape. With a final burst of energy, I reached the tracks. The train was nearly upon me, its headlights blinding. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell toward the edge of the tracks. And then, just as the train's massive wheels screeched against the rails, I felt it, a claw, sharp and cold, sinking into my back, dragging me back into the fog. The last thing I saw was the train's light, and then, nothing. The Day of the Dead. It's strange how a place so ordinary, so full of the day-to-day buzz of life, can suddenly feel off. That's how it started, anyway, an ordinary morning, just another shift in the underground tunnels beneath New York City. I remember stepping into the cavernous expanse, the echo of my boots clattering off the wet stone walls, the stale air clinging to the back of my throat. It was like any other day, or so I thought. The morning's routine had started like it always did, grabbing my gear, checking the lines, making sure the tunnel was clear for the work ahead. I had grown used to the tunnels. Most of us did. There was something comforting about the hum of the lights, the predictable sounds of machinery, the deep rumbles of trains echoing far above us. In those tunnels, there was a sense of isolation, but not the bad kind, the kind where you could lose yourself in the work and forget the city that was bustling miles away. But that day, the usual noises weren't enough to drown out the strange feeling creeping into the pit of my stomach. It started as a whisper, soft, barely perceptible, a skittering sound. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal scurrying in the darkness. But the noise kept coming, getting louder, almost rhythmic, like something large, something deliberate. I should have listened. As the day wore on, the sound only grew stronger. It wasn't just a passing breeze anymore, it was something following me, moving in the shadows. At first, I convinced myself it was just the old pipes or the shifting of the building's foundations. This was an old system, after all, a relic of a time before my own. It was bound to make odd noises. But the longer I stayed in the tunnels, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then there were the shadows. They weren't like the usual ones cast by flickering lights. No, these moved. I swear I saw them, just for a moment, darting past, fleeting as the blink of an eye. But they were there. They were real. Just your mind playing tricks, I told myself, forcing a chuckle to break the tension. But it didn't feel like a trick. The air, thick and stale, seemed to pulse around me as if the tunnels themselves were alive. My breath caught in my throat as I felt an eerie chill settle into the bones of the place. It was more than just the cold underground. It was something colder, something deeper. As I made my way down the corridor to inspect the next section of track, the shadows grew more pronounced. I swore the light above me flickered more than usual, casting erratic shapes that danced on the walls. I stopped for a moment, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and listened. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn the corner, it came again, closer this time, like the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the floor. The noise sent a jolt through me, a cold shiver trickling down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, the beam of my flashlight catching something just at the edge of the light, something large and moving. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew what it was. The outline was unmistakable. A giant rat, its body hunched, its glowing eyes reflecting the harsh beam of light. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the beam following the creature as it slinked into the shadows. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the sound, the faint, rhythmic scratching that seemed to follow the creature, as if there were more of them lurking just beyond the edge of light. A group. A whole group of them. I should have run then, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my chest tightening as I stared into the darkness, listening to the sounds creeping closer, surrounding me. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and twitch, as if alive, as if reaching for me. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I swallowed hard, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no rational explanation. There was no reason for what I was witnessing. And then, the noise stopped. Everything went still, as if the entire world had taken a collective breath. I dared to move, taking slow, measured steps, my flashlight scanning every corner of the tunnel. But it was too quiet, too unnatural. The shadows no longer seemed like mere shadows. They were too real, too alive. And then, as if on cue, a faint squeak echoed through the tunnels, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large scurrying across the ground. The noise was close. Too close. They were coming. I didn't wait to see more. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty tunnels. I couldn't tell if I was being pursued, but the sense of something waiting, watching, hung in the air like a dense fog, making it hard to breathe. I had to get out. I had to find the others. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The noise, the skittering, the scratching, it was following me, chasing me through the maze of tunnels. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the thick, oppressive darkness, but it felt like the shadows were closing in, stretching, warping around me. I had to think. I had to focus. But fear clouded my mind, blurring everything around me. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, farther from the exit. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, just my nerves playing tricks on me. But the sound, those unmistakable, clattering claws, told me it was real. I had worked in these tunnels long enough to know every twist and turn. But tonight, everything felt different. The walls seemed to move, the floor beneath me seemed to shift with each step. I could almost hear the distant voices of my coworkers, but it was no use. The tunnels were silent now, completely cut off from the outside world. I reached a junction and hesitated. Left or right? Both paths stretched into darkness, one more intimidating than the other. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to move. The screech of metal on metal echoed from the left tunnel, followed by a series of low, guttural growls, too low to be a rat, too deep. My body froze. My mind raced. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. They were close. The temperature dropped, a sudden chill creeping into my bones. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just hearing the sounds of rats. These things were something far worse, something more intelligent, more dangerous. I turned right, my steps quicker now, not knowing if it was the right choice, but too afraid to second guess. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But all I saw was the darkness. Except, no, wait. There it was again. That glint, just a flash in the distance. Those eyes. They were watching me. I quickened my pace, my mind swirling with panic. I couldn't help but wonder if this was it, if I had made a mistake by coming down here tonight. The noise was growing louder, the scuttling now unmistakable. I knew, without a doubt, that something was gaining on me. I needed to find the others. I needed to warn them. But as I sprinted down the corridor, the walls around me began to narrow. The familiar space of the tunnels, which had once felt like a second home, was now a maze of tight passages, all leading me deeper into the belly of the city. The lights above flickered again, the hum of electricity a sharp contrast to the terrifying silence surrounding me. Then, from up ahead, I heard something different, a voice. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen. "Hey, is anyone there?" The voice was distant, faint, but it was human. I ran toward it, my chest tightening with a mix of hope and dread. I had to find them. But the voice, once clear, suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, the lights went out. The tunnel was plunged into total darkness, and I was left with nothing but the rapid sound of my own heartbeat and the creeping, skittering noise that had been growing steadily louder. My breath came in shallow gasps, my flashlight useless in the pitch black. I could feel the weight of the dark pressing in on me, stifling every rational thought. Focus, I told myself. Don't panic. You've been down here before. But this was different. The air had changed. There was something unnatural about it now, a strange, suffocating heaviness that made it harder to breathe. I stumbled forward, trying to orient myself, but my mind was a blur. My feet shuffled over the uneven stone floor, and for a moment, the sound of my own footsteps felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. And then, there it was again. A sound, sharp and close, as if something large had just moved in the darkness. The unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. I didn't wait to look. My heart hammered in my chest as I bolted forward, blind, desperate to find the exit. But the shadows were closing in. Something brushed against my leg, cold, wet, and alive. I cried out, my foot catching on a loose rock as I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself before crashing to the ground. The flashlight had fallen from my hand, now useless, its beam lost in the dark. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I couldn't hear anything except my own frantic breathing. But I felt them. I felt their presence surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I pushed forward, forcing my legs to move even as fear threatened to overtake me. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching out before me like a dark, living thing. The sound of my own heartbeat was deafening in the silence, and I felt my panic rising. Then, just ahead of me, I saw it. The faintest glow. It was a light, flickering weakly, but it was light nonetheless. I ran toward it, ignoring the tightness in my chest, ignoring the voices in my head telling me I wasn't alone. The shadows followed me, relentless, and as I neared the light, I saw the figure standing there, a silhouette, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was one of the workers. Or it had been. I stopped short. The figure was hunched, its body twisted in unnatural ways, its face obscured by shadows. But I could still see it. The eyes, those glowing, eerie eyes, shone from the darkness. They weren't human. They never had been. My body froze. My pulse was a loud thud in my ears as the figure in front of me shifted, its form grotesque and unnatural. The eyes, those eyes, glowed in the darkness like twin embers, shining with a malevolent intelligence that sent chills down my spine. I took a step back, my breath shallow, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where? The tunnel behind me seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows thickening, the walls closing in. There was no escape. For a moment, I simply stared, my mind refusing to accept what was in front of me. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. I had to be imagining it, some trick of the mind brought on by stress, the darkness, the fear. But as the figure's head tilted slowly toward me, I knew. I wasn't imagining anything. This thing, whatever it was real. The creature's limbs were long, far too long, twisted unnaturally as if they had been bent and reshaped by some force beyond comprehension. Its skin, pale, stretched tight over its bones, looked almost translucent, a sickly shade of gray. And its eyes, those glowing eyes never left mine, locked on me with an unsettling, predatory gaze. I could hear my own heartbeat now, feel the frantic pulse of panic in my throat, but I couldn't look away. Its mouth, when it opened, revealed rows of sharp teeth, jagged and uneven, as if they were made to tear through flesh. A low, growling noise rumbled in its throat, more animal than human, and it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over debris scattered along the tunnel floor. My mind raced, trying to process everything, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. No logical reason for this thing, to be here. I had to move. But I couldn't. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figure shifted again, its movements smooth and unnatural, like something that didn't belong in the world I knew. A long clawed hand reached out, scraping against the stone wall. This is it. The thought came to me, clear and undeniable. I was going to die here. In these tunnels. Alone. But as my mind spiraled deeper into panic, something snapped inside me. I couldn't just give up. I couldn't let it end like this. Not here. Not now. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to get out, to find the exit. I could hear the creature behind me, its footfalls slow, deliberate, almost mocking, as if it were toying with me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in to fear. The light ahead, barely a flicker, seemed like a beacon, pulling me toward it. I pushed myself harder, faster, my legs burning with the effort, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much I tried to force myself forward, the tunnel seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, the light remaining just beyond reach. And then I heard it. A voice. A whisper, so soft I thought I had imagined it, but unmistakable. Run. It was a voice I recognized, faint but clear, a colleague, a friend. Someone who had worked beside me for years. But how could they be here? I pushed forward, desperation clawing at my chest. Where are you? I shouted, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the silence that followed was more terrifying than anything. The tunnel was closing in. The shadows were stretching longer, merging with the darkness, swallowing everything in their path. I couldn't tell where the walls began or ended. I could feel them, they were out there, in the darkness, watching, waiting. But I had to keep moving. I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it. The opening. The light. The exit. My heart surged with hope, a last burst of energy flooding through me. I was almost there. Almost free. I could hear the creature behind me again, its footsteps closer now, almost on top of me. Its breath was a hot, fetid thing, and I could hear it rattling from the depths of its chest as if it were savoring every moment of my fear. The light was almost within reach. One more step. But before I could take it, a hand, too cold, too sharp, shot out from the shadows and wrapped around my ankle. I screamed as I fell to the ground, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. My flashlight skittered out of my hand, rolling away into the darkness. Panic flooded my body as the thing dragged me back, its grip unrelenting, pulling me closer into the abyss. I fought, kicking, clawing at the floor, but it was no use. The creature's strength was overwhelming. It yanked me closer, dragging me back toward it, its cold breath washing over me. And then, in the darkness, I heard something else. A sound I hadn't noticed before, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the growls of the creature. Get away from him. The voice was distant, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. In an instant, the creature paused, its head snapping toward the sound. A low growl rumbled in its throat, but it didn't move. A second later, a figure emerged from the shadows, one I hadn't seen in the chaos. A man. He moved swiftly, purposefully, and before I could fully process what was happening, he was on the creature, slamming something into its side with a force that made the ground shake. The creature hissed, recoiling. I could hear the sound of its claws scraping against stone, its cries of pain. The man grabbed me, pulling me from the creature's grip with a strength I hadn't expected. We ran, stumbling, barely managing to stay on our feet. Behind us, I could hear the creature's roars, echoing through the tunnels, but we didn't stop. I didn't stop. We reached the end of the tunnel, the exit finally in sight. And then, just before I crossed the threshold into the light, I heard a voice, deep, guttural, and filled with malice, whispering in the darkness behind me. "You will never escape." The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the creature's glowing eyes, watching me. And then, nothing. I stumbled into the dim light of the room, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. My legs wobbled beneath me, and the man who had pulled me out of the tunnel steadied me with one hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the chaos we had just survived. I could barely comprehend what had happened, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. Who was this man? Why had he helped me? How had he known where to find me? He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the tunnel entrance as if he were waiting for something, waiting for it to follow us. The air between us was thick with tension, the silence more deafening than any sound. Are you okay?" His voice was raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in days. Or longer. He didn't look like a regular worker, there was something off about him. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt and dust, as if he had been living in the tunnels for a long time. I nodded, trying to steady my breath, my heart still racing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't far behind, that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thing in the tunnel, I gasped, my voice shaking. What was it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the empty space around us, as though expecting the darkness to reach out and claim him at any moment. "It's not just in the tunnels," he said quietly. "It's everywhere. It's always been there. Waiting." I frowned, my mind racing to process his words. Everywhere? Waiting? What did he mean? But before I could ask, a loud crash echoed through the walls, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The floor beneath us trembled as if something massive was moving just below the surface. I spun around, my breath hitching in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer. The man grabbed my arm, his grip tightening. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here. Now." He started pulling me toward a narrow stairwell at the far end of the room, his pace quick and determined. I wanted to protest, to ask him more questions, but my feet seemed to move on their own, following him blindly. The sound of the creature's steps was growing louder, more distinct now. It was coming, and we were in its path. We reached the stairwell, and the man yanked open a rusty door that led to an old elevator shaft. It was barely wide enough for us both to fit, but somehow we squeezed in. "Do you have a way out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me as he pressed a button on the control panel. The elevator jerked, groaned, and then began to rise slowly, the sound of the creature's growls still echoing in the tunnels below us. "We'll be safe for a while," he said, his voice almost reassuring. "But not for long. We have to reach the surface before it catches up." The elevator moved steadily upward, but the air felt suffocating. The man was tense beside me, his eyes scanning the walls, his fingers twitching as if he were waiting for something. I couldn't help but feel the same unease gnawing at my stomach. "What is it?" I asked, my voice thick with dread. "What's really down there in the tunnels?" He turned to face me, his eyes dark with something that looked like regret. "They're not just creatures," he said quietly. "They were once people. Like us." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" He paused, his gaze flickering to the shaft above us, the rusted metal creaking under the strain of the old elevator. "The Day of the Dead, it's not just a day. It's a curse. Those who die on that day don't truly die. Their souls, they remain. But their bodies? Their bodies are taken. Transformed." I recoiled, the thought of what he was saying sinking into my bones like ice. Transformed into what? He hesitated for a long moment, his face hardening with a look of haunted desperation. "Into those things. The things you saw in the tunnel. The things that hunted you. They were once human. But the curse, it twists them. It takes their humanity and leaves only the monster." I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine. My mind struggled to wrap around the idea. The creatures, the things I'd seen, they were people once? How was that even possible? Before I could respond, the elevator shuddered to a halt, throwing us both off balance. The door at the top opened with a loud creak, revealing the dim light of the surface world, almost peaceful in comparison to the horrors below. I stumbled out, gasping in relief as fresh air hit my lungs. But the man didn't stop. He kept moving, pulling me toward the street. "There's more to this place than you understand," he said, his tone suddenly serious. This isn't over." And that's when I heard it again. The sound. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. It wasn't the creature from the tunnels. It was something else. Something worse. I turned to look behind us. In the distance, barely visible in the shadows of the alleyway, there was another figure. It was tall, distorted, its shape bending unnaturally as it moved toward us. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them. And I knew, without a doubt, that we hadn't escaped. We'd only begun to face the true terror. The Day of the Dead had only just begun. The figure in the shadows didn't move like a person. It was a grotesque mockery of humanity, its limbs stretching and contracting in ways that defied the laws of nature. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, locked on me with an intensity that pierced my very soul. The man beside me didn't hesitate. He grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward an old, crumbling building. I stumbled behind him, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and panicked. There was no time to think, no time to question what was happening. Only survival. We reached the door of the building, and he kicked it open with surprising strength. The door creaked and groaned as it gave way, revealing a dimly lit hallway. I could hear the soft echo of footsteps, our footsteps, on the cracked tile floor, but above that, there was something else. A faint whisper, like the wind blowing through cracks in the walls. "You have to listen to me," the man said urgently, pulling me inside and slamming the door shut behind us. "They're coming. They won't stop. I tried to calm myself, tried to focus, but the words he spoke only fueled my terror. They're coming. Who were they? What was he talking about? And why did I feel like I was being drawn into something much darker than I could ever have imagined? The building we were in seemed abandoned, a forgotten relic of a time long past. Dust hung in the air, the smell of decay permeating everything. But as we moved deeper into the building, the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, sharp, cold, like fingers brushing against my skin. What is this place? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. A safe house, he replied quickly, his face grim. For people who know. For those who have seen the truth. I wanted to ask more, but the words died in my throat as I noticed something in the corner of the room. A shape, shifting in the dim light. It was a person, or at least it had once been. Now, it was something else entirely. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, two pools of glowing light, but its body was twisted, deformed, like it had been molded by some otherworldly force. It moved, but not like a human. It was slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The man grabbed my arm again, his fingers digging into my skin. We need to go, he said, his voice trembling. Now. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The fear was overwhelming, drowning out all reason. But as we turned to leave, I heard the whisper again. Only this time, it was clearer. And it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from the walls. The words were distorted, like a broken record, but I could make them out. The dead walk. The day is theirs. A cold chill ran through me as I realized the truth. The curse wasn't just a story. It wasn't some myth or superstition. It was real. And we were trapped in it. Before I could say anything, the ground shook beneath us. A deafening roar echoed through the building, shaking the walls and sending dust and debris raining down. I grabbed onto the nearest pillar, my heart racing as the building seemed to groan in protest. Get to the basement, the man shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. We can't stay here. They're coming for us. I didn't ask questions. I followed him as he pulled me toward a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. The air grew colder as we moved deeper into the building, and the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, as if they were right beside us. When we reached the basement, I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a tomb. The basement was filled with strange symbols etched into the walls, old and faded, as if they had been there for centuries. The floor was covered in dust and shattered glass, and in the center of the room was a large stone altar, dark and foreboding. What is this place? I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He was already at the altar, his hands shaking as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, ornate knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, sharp and deadly. This is where it all began, he said quietly, his eyes distant. This is where the curse was born. Before I could respond, I heard a loud crash from above. The floor above us cracked, and the sounds of movement, heavy, monstrous, rumbled through the building. They were here. And they were coming for us. The man turned to face me, his expression wild, desperate. You don't understand. They're not just looking for us. They want the sacrifice. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The ground shook again, this time more violently, and I saw it. The thing from the tunnels. It was here. Its grotesque form twisted in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its mouth stretched in a grotesque, silent scream. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The creature advanced, its movements slow but inevitable, like a death sentence closing in. The man stood beside the altar, holding the knife. His hands were trembling, but there was a strange determination in his eyes. He turned to me, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "This is the only way," he said. "You have to do it. You have to end it." I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. But before I could ask what he meant, the creature lunged, its jaws snapping open with terrifying force. The world went black. Guests from the worlds. It all began with a question that still haunts me. How could something so ordinary be so terrifying? The first strange occurrence was subtle, almost undetectable. I worked as a laborer on one of the many subway expansion projects in New York City. The work was hard but routine, nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual hum of machines, the flicker of lights, and the dust that seemed to find its way into every corner of our existence. But one day, that hum changed. It started with a soft rustling sound, like paper being crumpled. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning malfunctioning, or maybe a loose wire causing the hum to shift. I didn't think much of it until I heard it again, louder this time. S-H-H-H-H-H-H. The sound seemed to echo down the long, narrow tunnel that we were working in. It wasn't wind. It wasn't machinery. It was something else. Something alive. I glanced at my coworkers, but no one seemed to notice. They were all focused on their tasks, their eyes trained on the work, their minds elsewhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noise persisted, growing faintly louder, as if the very walls of the tunnel were beginning to hum with a life of their own. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. One of the men, Tony, looked up at me with a blank expression, his eyes tired. "Hear what?" Before I could respond, the sound stopped. It was like a switch had been flipped. For a moment, everything felt too still, too quiet. Then came the shadow. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, something that didn't quite belong, like the sudden movement of a bird against the backdrop of static. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I shook my head, brushing it off. It had to be my mind playing tricks. But as I bent down to pick up a tool, I caught sight of something in the darkness. A shape moving against the grain of the dimly lit tunnel. It wasn't the usual jumble of shadows cast by our lights. This was deliberate, purposeful. "Hey, Tony," I called again, my voice more insistent this time. "You see that?" Tony didn't respond, and I didn't wait. I walked towards the flickering shadow. With each step, my heart beat faster, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Something was off, something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The closer I got to the shape, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, tall, hunched, moving with an unsettling grace. As I squinted into the darkness, I saw its eyes, glowing, red, and filled with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I froze. My body refused to move, to react. But my mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, to find the others and get the hell out of the tunnel. But it was too late. From the corner of my eye, I saw a dozen more shapes, emerging from the darkness like predators drawn to the scent of prey. And then the sound came again, the soft, unmistakable rustling. But this time, it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from the ground beneath my feet. Scratch. Scrape. Thud. I could feel it now, the vibrations of something massive moving just below the surface. The ground trembled, and for a moment, I thought the entire tunnel might collapse. My instinct screamed at me to run, to escape before whatever was coming found me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creatures. They weren't rats. Not like any rats I'd ever seen before. Their bodies were too large, too grotesque. Their fur was matted and filthy, their teeth sharp and yellow, their eyes gleaming in the dark like predatory lanterns. One of them skittered forward, its claws clicking against the concrete floor. It paused for a moment, sniffing the air, before it locked its gaze onto me. My heart stopped. I took a step back, my foot catching on a loose piece of debris. As I stumbled, the creature lunged, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged, yellow teeth. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted down the tunnel, my feet pounding against the ground, the sound of the creatures following close behind. I didn't know how many there were, but I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their presence pushing against my back. I turned a corner, almost slipping on the wet concrete, and ran straight into Tony. He looked as shocked as I felt. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. Before I could answer, we heard it, another rustle, louder this time. Then a scrape, like claws on metal, followed by an awful, wet thud. I turned toward the sound, my eyes searching the darkness. But I couldn't see anything, only the oppressive blackness, the air thick with something that didn't belong. "We need to get out of here," Tony said, his voice shaking. "Now." We didn't need to say anything else. Without another word, we both turned and ran, but we were already too late. The creatures were coming. And they weren't alone. I don't know how long we ran for. Time lost all meaning in those dark, oppressive tunnels. Every step felt like an eternity, and every breath I took burned with fear. The ground shook beneath us, the air grew thick with the unmistakable scent of decay, and those rustling sounds, always just behind us, kept urging me forward. Tony's panicked breath echoed in my ears, but it wasn't just his. There were more. More footsteps. More shadows. And the sounds, the scrapes and clicks of claws on stone, grew louder with each passing moment. "Are they chasing us?" Tony gasped between breaths. I could hardly answer. The words stuck in my throat. What could I say? That we were being hunted by something not of this world? That we had barely escaped with our lives so far, and now it felt like the walls were closing in? I glanced over my shoulder. My pulse quickened. A pair of glowing eyes gleamed in the distance. Then another. And another. The creatures weren't just following us anymore. They were closing in. We reached an intersection in the tunnels, 3 separate paths, all equally dark, all equally suffocating. I could hear the shuffling, the scratching, coming from every direction. My instinct screamed at me to pick a direction, to do anything, but I couldn't think. Every tunnel looked the same, each one more nightmarish than the last. "What do we do?" Tony asked, his voice wavering with desperation. "We can't outrun them. We're trapped." I felt it too. The cold sweat running down my spine. The nausea curling in my gut. We were trapped, with no way out. I grabbed Tony's arm and yanked him down the left tunnel, hoping that it was the right choice, hoping that it led to some kind of escape. My mind raced as I searched for some sort of plan, something, anything that could save us. But my thoughts were clouded with panic. Keep running. Keep moving. Don't look back. But I couldn't stop myself. I looked back. There they were. The rats, or whatever they were, swarming into the intersection behind us. Their eyes flickered in the darkness, lighting up the tunnel like fireflies in a graveyard. Their bodies moved with terrifying precision, their steps synchronized, as if they were no longer just creatures, but something else, something sentient. We had been running for what felt like hours, but I could still hear them closing in on us. There was no escape. No way out. The tunnel ahead was no better. It stretched on and on, the faint sound of rushing water echoing from somewhere deeper in the bowels of the city. But as we ran, the walls around us started to change. They weren't just stone and concrete anymore. The smooth surfaces began to crack, revealing strange, jagged patterns beneath. Faint, glowing symbols. Symbols I didn't recognize. What the hell? Tony breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't answer him. I was too focused on the walls. They were shifting, pulsing. The air around us grew colder, and the once familiar hum of the subway tracks began to fade into an eerie silence. The creatures were gone, but I felt their presence all around us. In the cold, in the shadows, in the very air we breathed. We reached a dead end. A concrete wall stood in front of us, stark and imposing. No way forward. No way back. I felt my stomach twist with fear, my chest tightening. Now what? Tony said, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. Shoo. Shoo. The rustling began again, this time from above. I glanced up. There, in the shadows, perched high on the walls, were dozens of creatures. Their red eyes glowed like burning embers in the dark. They had surrounded us. Tony's breath caught in his throat. I could see the terror in his eyes, the realization that we were cornered. I stepped back, pressing myself against the cold wall. My mind raced, trying to think of something, anything. But there was nothing. No escape. No help. Shoo. Shoo. Then, the sound stopped. The creatures froze, their eyes still locked onto us, their claws twitching in anticipation. Is this it? I thought. Are we going to die here, in these tunnels, forgotten by the world above? But something changed. The creatures' eyes seemed to widen, their bodies stilled. Then, one of them stepped forward. Slowly. Methodically. It stopped just in front of me, and I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was sizing me up. It wasn't like the others, this one was different. It didn't move like a rat. It didn't look like a rat. It stood up straight, towering over me, its fur matted and wet, its eyes impossibly large and intelligent. What the hell is it? It spoke. At first, the sound was garbled, a whisper lost in translation, but then I understood. You shouldn't be here. The voice was deep, ancient. It sent a chill through my spine. Tony looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can understand it? He whispered. I nodded, but I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling. The words didn't make sense. But it was speaking to us, speaking with a clarity I could feel in my bones. Leave now, It said again, more insistent this time, before it is too late. I didn't know what it meant, but it was clear. It wasn't asking us to leave because we were unwelcome, it was warning us. Before it is too late. The ground shook once more, a deep, guttural rumble that echoed throughout the tunnels. A loud crack split the air, and the walls began to tremble. The glowing symbols in the stone flashed brighter, as if something was waking. I didn't need any more warnings. Without a word, I grabbed Tony's arm and pulled him away, running down the only path that didn't seem to be swallowed by the chaos. But the creatures didn't follow. They didn't need to. They had said their piece. And now, it was too late. I don't remember how long we ran. The tunnels stretched out in every direction, like veins in some dark and monstrous creature's body. Every footstep echoed, sending ripples through the thick, stagnant air. Tony's breathing had slowed to shallow gasps, but the weight of the silence around us made each one feel like a distant thunderclap. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. I could feel it, though, an overwhelming sense of dread closing on us, wrapping its cold fingers around our throats. That thing, the creature that had spoken to us, it had warned us. But warned us about what? Do you think we're going to make it out? Tony's voice broke the silence, small and fragile. I wanted to tell him something reassuring. I wanted to say anything that might calm his nerves, but my own mind was swirling with confusion and fear. The warning, the creatures, they weren't just animals. They were something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. Just keep moving, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't for him, it was for me. My own mind needed something to hold on to. We reached another intersection, this one bathed in a dim, flickering light that seemed to pulse from nowhere. It cast long, unnatural shadows across the walls, making the whole place feel like a waking nightmare. I stopped. Something felt off. My heart began to pound harder in my chest as I scanned the surroundings. The walls seemed to ripple, shifting in ways that couldn't be explained. The same glowing symbols we had seen earlier flickered and danced across the stone as though they were alive, as if the very earth beneath us was alive. Where are we? Tony's voice trembled, his gaze fixed on the walls. He looked like he was starting to crack. I don't know, I whispered, though I was starting to get a sinking feeling in my gut. But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here. Something caught my eye. At the far end of the tunnel, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, was a shape. A shadow, moving. Slowly. Methodically. It didn't seem like a creature, though. There was something distinctly human about it. I stiffened. Do you see that? Tony turned toward the shape. What the hell is that? The figure didn't respond, didn't even flinch. It just kept moving, its silhouette growing clearer the closer it came. The faint sound of its footsteps echoed through the tunnel, but it wasn't the sound of hurried steps. It was the sound of something, waiting. Something that knew we would come. As it drew closer, the shape resolved into a man, or, at least, it looked like one. But there was something wrong with him. His clothes were torn and ragged, his skin pale and lifeless. As though he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. No fear. Only emptiness. Who are you? Tony called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. I could see the fear in his eyes. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at us, its gaze piercing, its expression frozen, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for us to make the next move. I couldn't take it anymore. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I turned to Tony. "We need to go. Now." But before I could move, the figure did. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving us. And then it spoke, its voice a rasp, like the last breath of someone who had long since forgotten how to live. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice reverberating through the tunnel. "You're not supposed to be here." The words hit me like a cold wind, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was as if the very air had been stolen from my lungs. A shiver ran through my body, and I felt a deep, gnawing terror begin to rise in my chest. Not supposed to be here? The figure took another step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. I felt trapped. We were trapped. This man, if that's what he even was, wasn't human. He was something else. Something that had been here long before we ever stumbled into these tunnels. "You've already crossed the threshold," he continued, his voice growing more hollow. "There's no going back." I could hear Tony behind me, his breath sharp, ragged, panicked. But I didn't dare look away from the figure. I didn't dare break my gaze, because something deep within me told me that if I did, we would disappear. If I turned my back, the world would swallow us whole. The man reached out toward us, his bony hand outstretched, his fingers twitching like they were pulling at something unseen. "You will stay here," he said. "You will never leave." Suddenly, the air shifted. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the walls began to groan. A low, rumbling noise echoed from deep within the earth, growing louder and louder until it felt like the whole tunnel was shaking apart. The shadows around us deepened, shifting in ways that defied reason. I could feel the darkness closing in, smothering us. I could hear the creatures, their claws scraping against stone, their eyes glowing in the dark. They were coming, drawn by the disturbance. By us. I had to move. We had to get out. I grabbed Tony's arm and pulled him, but he didn't move. He was frozen, his eyes locked onto the figure, his mouth open but unable to speak. His body trembled like a leaf in a storm. "No," I whispered, my voice full of desperation. "Tony, we have to go. Now." Finally, he snapped out of it. He looked at me, fear flooding his face, and nodded. We turned and ran, the air thick with dread, the tunnel stretching endlessly before us. But the figure's voice followed us, a low, mocking whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You can't outrun it." The walls seemed to close in on us, the shadows growing darker with every step. The scratching sounds of the creatures grew louder, more frantic, as if they were right on our heels. And in the distance, just ahead, I saw another figure. A shape darker than the rest. It wasn't a man. It was something far worse. The darkness seemed to deepen as we ran. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until the space between us and the shadows felt suffocating. Tony was beside me, but his breath was growing erratic, his footsteps faltering with every passing second. I could feel him slowing, his will to keep going slipping away. He wasn't going to make it. "Tony!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice as I grabbed his arm, forcing him to keep moving. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and distant, as though he wasn't seeing me at all. "We're not going to make it out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We're trapped. We've crossed over, you heard him. We're stuck here." I shook him, desperate. "No. We can get out." We can still make it if we... The ground shook, cutting me off. A low rumbling noise came from the farthest reaches of the tunnel, the kind that made my bones vibrate. It wasn't the tremor of the earth. It was something deeper, something older. And then came the sound of claws scraping against stone. We were being hunted. Move! I shouted again, my voice hoarse. There was no time for explanations, no time for comfort. I had to drag Tony forward, my heart hammering in my chest as the noises grew louder, closer. Whatever was chasing us was getting faster. We rounded another bend in the tunnel, and the walls seemed to close in even more. The shadows weren't just moving, they were alive. They twisted and stretched, warping like liquid under the dim light. The flickering bulbs above us buzzed erratically, casting frantic, broken images along the walls. Don't look back. Don't look back. I forced myself to ignore the creeping dread that clawed at my thoughts. We had to focus. We had to find a way out. But every instinct I had screamed that it was too late. That whatever we had uncovered was already consuming us. Then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't in my head, it was real. I heard it, and it was getting louder. You cannot escape. You cannot return. Tony's eyes grew even wider, if that was even possible. He was shaking his head violently, as though he was trying to block out the sound, but the whisper was everywhere, clawing at his mind, feeding his fear. I could feel it too, the pressure mounting, like the very air around us was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. We weren't just running from something physical. This thing, whatever it was twisting the reality around us. It was pulling at the fabric of the world itself, warping it to trap us. Please, Tony gasped, barely able to speak now. We can't go any farther. We need to stop. I stopped and turned to face him, gripping his shoulders. His face was pale, eyes wild, like a man on the verge of losing his sanity. I had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had been driven to the brink, someone who had seen something they couldn't comprehend. No, Tony! I yelled, forcing him to focus. We can't stop. We can't give up now. You have to fight it. Do you understand? We have to fight it. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls with a terrible force. You've already lost. The worlds are merging. You cannot stop it. It will consume you, just like it consumed the others. I could see the fear in Tony's eyes, his body trembling uncontrollably. I could feel it too, the pull of the dark world around us, wrapping itself tighter and tighter. Suddenly, the tunnel in front of us exploded with movement. Shapes, massive, shifting shapes, appeared out of the shadows. They were no longer just the creatures we had seen before. These were something else. Something worse. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural, sickly light, and their bodies were twisted, contorted into forms that no human could ever understand. Some were humanoid, others animalistic, but all of them radiated a kind of hunger, a primal, insatiable thirst for something, us, perhaps. I grabbed Tony again, pulling him toward a side tunnel that branched off ahead, but my legs were shaking. My mind was screaming that there was no way out. The creatures were all around us now, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their mouths opening and closing in eerie unison. We ran blindly down the side tunnel, the air growing colder with each step. But the shadows were following, the walls themselves seemed to be shifting, closing in tighter and tighter. Every step we took only seemed to get us closer to the void, to the edge of something too terrifying to name. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The tunnel before us, it wasn't a tunnel anymore. It was a vast, yawning abyss. A black void that stretched endlessly into nothingness. The walls had disappeared, leaving only darkness. Tony froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the creatures moving closer, the sound of claws clicking against stone. Their whispers, too, began to rise in volume, overlapping in a twisted chorus. "This is the end," a voice whispered from the darkness. "This is where you will remain. Forever." I turned back toward Tony, but the look in his eyes was no longer one of fear. It was resignation. He had accepted it. The dark world was consuming him, too. "No," I whispered, backing away, my heart racing. And then, a flash. A shape, familiar, yet impossible, appeared in the void. It was the man we had seen before, the one who had spoken to us, his face now stretched and grotesque, his eyes filled with an emptiness that seemed to swallow the very light around us. "You cannot escape it," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous. "You are already a part of this world. You have always been." And then, without warning, the world around me began to collapse. The walls, the darkness, the very air, everything shifted, twisted, and tore apart. I was falling into nothing. I couldn't breathe. The fall was endless, like the very fabric of reality had unraveled beneath me. Darkness closed in from every side, crushing me, pulling me deeper into some unfathomable abyss. It wasn't just physical. It was as though my very consciousness was being torn apart, stretched across infinite dimensions, none of them truly real, none of them truly mine. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself completely, the sensation of falling stopped. I was no longer plummeting, but standing, no, kneeling, on solid ground. My knees dug into cold stone, and the air around me was thick with the stench of decay and rot. I gasped, my chest heaving, but the air tasted wrong, like it didn't belong in my lungs. My mind struggled to process what was happening, the pain, the disorientation. Slowly, I lifted my head. It was dark, darker than anything I had ever seen. There were no stars, no lights, no signs of life. It was an abyss, a void stretching endlessly in every direction. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled under me, forcing me back to my knees. I wasn't alone. I could feel them watching. Tons of eyes, glowing faintly in the endless dark, all around me. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head to see them, countless figures, all staring, all waiting. Their shapes were not quite human, not quite animal, and not quite anything I could comprehend. Their eyes gleamed, and I could hear their breath, hollow, mechanical, as though they weren't even alive anymore. "Tony," I croaked, my voice breaking as I searched the darkness. But he was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. I stood up shakily, my body trembling as the cold seeped into my skin. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be a part of whatever this place was. But as I tried to move, I realized my legs were no longer my own. They were being drawn back, slowly, as though some invisible force was pulling at me, binding me to the ground. The figures in the darkness shifted. They were closing in, their eyes flickering with hunger. And I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that they weren't waiting for me to escape. They were waiting for me to give in. "You're a part of it now," a voice whispered from somewhere within the dark. It was the same voice from before. The voice that had haunted us, that had led us into this madness. You cannot escape the worlds you've crossed into. The borders are gone. You belong to them now. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the thick silence that surrounded me. My body, though still fighting, was weakening. The darkness around me was bleeding into my veins, into my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with dread. I thought about the strange man we had seen earlier, the one who had told us we had crossed over. You've always been here. His words echoed in my head, reverberating, distorting into something unrecognizable. Had we always been part of this world? Had we always been trapped in this nightmare, living in one reality and yet not really a part of it? The figures closed in, their movements slow and deliberate. They surrounded me, their hands reaching out, but their eyes, they were the worst part. The eyes were the same as those that had been haunting us, pulling us into the darkness, coaxing us into submission. They weren't just looking at me. They were inside me. This is your fate, the voice continued, now seeming to come from all directions. You will never leave this place. No one does. Not those who come, and not those who are always here. And then, in the distance, something shifted. A low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, like something deep below the surface of the world was moving. The ground trembled, but not from anything earthly. It was as if the world itself was shaking under the weight of something ancient, something far older than anything we could comprehend. I felt it then. A strange pulling sensation. The figures began to fade, their eyes losing their gleam, as if they were retreating from something. Their shadows twisted and vanished into the blackness, leaving only a faint echo of their presence. And in the silence, I heard a whisper. It wasn't the cold, malevolent voice from before. No, this was different. This was a voice I didn't recognize, yet somehow it felt familiar, like an echo of something I had lost. Run. Without thinking, I forced myself to move. My legs screamed in protest, my body rebelling, but somehow, I ran. I ran from the darkness, from the cold, from the shadows that had once been figures but now were nothing more than whispers in the void. I ran, not knowing where I was going or if I was even going to make it out. The air around me was thick, suffocating, but there was someone, calling me forward. The ground beneath my feet began to shift. The walls of the dark abyss were crumbling, disintegrating, as though the very reality I had been trapped in was falling apart. I kept running, never looking back, never slowing down. I could hear the whispers growing fainter, the creatures retreating, but I knew they weren't gone. They were always there, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the world changed. I stumbled out of the tunnel, gasping for air. The bright, blinding lights of the city burned my eyes. I was back. I was back in the world I knew. But was it the same? I looked around, my heart racing. The streets were empty. The buildings were silent. It was like a ghost town, like a memory I had forgotten. But I wasn't alone. I felt their presence. The shadows, the eyes, they were here too. Watching. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth. I wasn't free. I never had been. The worlds had collided, and I was part of them now. There was no escape. No return. The darkness would always be with me. The worlds had crossed. And now, we would never be the same. hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.